For 6 months, Margaret Doyle stayed 45 minutes past the end of her shift, every single night to sit in a hard plastic chair beside a dying man's bed and read to him out loud. She never charged the hospital for that time. She never told her supervisor she was doing it, not at first, and she certainly never told her husband the whole truth of why she kept coming home so late that he started leaving her plate warming in the oven without being asked. All she knew in the beginning was that room 412 at the end of the long-term care hall held an old man named Walter Voss, who had no visitors, no photographs on his windowsill, and no family who called, and that something in her could not walk past that door at the end of a 12-hour shift and simply go home. She thought she was doing a small kindness for a lonely stranger who happened to have nobody left. She had no idea that the frail 81-year-old man in that bed had quietly built the very hospital wing she worked in, had funded the cancer center down the hall and the neonatal unit 2 floors up and the free clinic across town, all without ever once putting his name on a plaque, and that in the last winter of his life, her voice reading old books out loud in a fluorescent-lit room would become the reason he decided, finally, to save the place that had quietly saved so many others. My name doesn't matter as much as hers does in this story, but I want to tell it the way it actually happened, in order, starting from the ordinary Tuesday in early October, when Margaret Doyle first walked into that room and had absolutely no idea her whole life was about to bend around a stranger she'd only meant to check vital signs on. Harrow Falls, Pennsylvania, is not a big town. It has 1 high school, 1 movie theater that still shows second-run films for $3 on Tuesdays, and 1 hospital, St. Aldrich's Memorial, a squat brick building on the north side of town that has been patched, expanded, and stitched back together so many times over 90 years that longtime nurses joked you could read the town's entire economic history in the mismatched additions, glass and steel bolted onto brick, bolted onto older brick. Maggie, as everyone called her, had worked the night shift at St. Aldrich's for 11 years, ever since she'd finished her nursing degree at the community college 40 minutes north and come home to Harrow Falls because her mother was sick and somebody needed to be close. Her mother had passed 4 years into that arrangement, but by then Maggie had already married Danny Doyle, a broad-shouldered, quiet electrician with kind eyes and an old pickup truck, and they'd had 2 kids, Sam, who was 9 and obsessed with dinosaurs bigger than his own body, and Lucy, who was 6 and had strong opinions about which socks were acceptable on any given day. Maggie worked 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 nights a week, on the 3rd floor, which housed general medicine on one end and past a set of double doors that stuck a little in humid weather, the long-term and hospice care wing on the other. She'd been floated to that wing more times than she could count over the years, covering for nurses who called out sick, filling gaps during flu season, and she had learned, the way most good nurses eventually learn, that the long-term wing asked something different of you than the rest of the hospital did. Down in the emergency department, everything moved fast, adrenaline and protocol, and the next crisis already walking through the doors. Up in long-term care, time moved differently. People weren't there to get fixed and discharged. Some of them were there because there was nowhere else for them to be. No family able or willing to care for them at home, no assisted living facility with an open bed, or simply too much illness for any home to safely hold. It was, Maggie had always privately thought, the loneliest hallway in the building, and also, in its strange, quiet way, one of the most important, because the people in those rooms had almost always run out of people who came to see them. Walter Voss had been in room 412 for 11 days before Maggie was assigned to his hall on a permanent basis, after the previous rotation nurse, an efficient young man named Corey, transferred to the surgical unit. The admitting notes on the chart were spare in the way medical charts often are about a person's actual life. 81-year-old male, admitted following a fall in his home resulting in a fractured hip, complicated by aspiration pneumonia during recovery, chronic atrial fibrillation, moderate congestive heart failure, prognosis guarded, code status full unless updated. No emergency contact listed except an attorney's office in Philadelphia with a number that, when the admissions clerk had called it during intake, had simply directed her to leave a message with a paralegal who promised someone would call back and then never did. No next of kin at the bedside, no visitors in 11 days. A room that, unlike nearly every other room on that hall, had no cards taped to the wall, no flowers wilting on the windowsill, no photographs of grandchildren propped against the water pitcher. The first time Maggie walked into room 412 to check vitals, on a rainy Tuesday evening in the first week of October, she found an old man sitting bolt upright against his pillows in the dark. Because he hadn't asked anyone to turn the light on and apparently hadn't wanted to bother pressing the call button just to ask for that, staring at the blank television mounted on the wall as though it were playing something only he could see. He had a full head of white hair, neatly combed despite the fact that no one had visited him, sharp blue eyes that had gone a little cloudy at the edges with age but hadn't lost any of their attention, and long, elegant hands that Maggie noticed immediately because they didn't match the rest of the room, didn't match the frayed hospital gown or the government-issue blanket. They were the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime doing something careful with them. "Good evening," Maggie said, flipping on the overhead light with an apology already in her voice. "Sorry, sir, I didn't realize you were sitting in the dark. I'm Maggie. I'll be your nurse tonight." "That's quite all right," the old man said, and his voice was low, cultured in a way that seemed slightly out of place in a public hospital in a town like Harrow Falls, though Maggie couldn't have said exactly why she noticed that. "I find I don't mind the dark as much as I once did. Walter Voss. Pleased to meet you, Maggie." He said it like a man greeting someone at a dinner party, not like a patient greeting a nurse who was about to take his blood pressure, and something about the courtliness of it, the sheer unnecessary graciousness of a lonely old man in an empty room, taking the trouble to be pleasant to a stranger, stuck with her all through her rounds that night. She checked his vitals, noted them without incident, asked the standard questions about pain and appetite and sleep, and he answered every one fully and precisely, the way a person answers who has spent a career being asked precise questions and expected to give precise answers back. When she asked if he needed anything else before she left, he hesitated, just slightly in a way she almost missed. "No," he said. "Thank you, Maggie. I'm quite all right." But she had caught the hesitation, the half-second where something had almost been asked and then folded back up and put away, and 11 years of night shift nursing had taught her that the thing patients almost asked for was very often the thing they needed most and were least willing to admit needing. She thought about it on her drive home that morning, the light just coming up gray and wet over the hills outside Harrow Falls, and she thought about it again the next night when she clocked in and saw his name, still on her assignment sheet, still no visitors logged, still no cards on the wall. It was 3 nights later, on a Friday, that she found out what the almost question had been. She'd finished her rounds early for once, an unusually quiet night on the hall. 2 of her other patients sound asleep and stable, and she found herself standing in the doorway of 412 again, where Walter Voss sat exactly as he had the first night, upright, alert, staring at nothing in particular, a thin paperback book resting closed on his blanket that she hadn't noticed before. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "I sleep during the day mostly," he said. "Old habit. Never could sleep well at night, not since I was young. My late wife used to say I ran on a different clock than the rest of the world." A small, private smile crossed his face at the memory, there and gone. "Eleanor used to read to me in the evenings when the insomnia got bad. She had a lovely voice for it. I find I can't manage to read for long myself anymore, not since the stroke I had 2 years before this hip business. Letters swim a bit if I look at them too long. I never got around to mentioning it because it seemed a foolish thing to burden a nurse with." Maggie looked at the paperback on his blanket. It was a battered old copy of the Odyssey, the cover soft and cracked with age, clearly a book that had traveled a long way to end up on a hospital blanket in Harrow Falls, Pennsylvania. "What page were you on?" she asked, before she'd fully decided to ask it. Walter looked up at her, and for just a moment, something moved behind his cloudy blue eyes that looked almost like surprise, as if he hadn't expected the question, hadn't dared to expect it, and was recalibrating quickly to make sure he hadn't misheard. "Page 81, he said. "Odysseus has just washed up on the island of the Phaeacians, naked, half drowned, entirely at the mercy of strangers. That seems like an unfair place to get stuck, Maggie said, glancing at the clock, doing quick math on her shift, on Danny at home with the kids, on the meal she'd promised to make on her day off, on all the ordinary math a working mother does 40 times a day without noticing she's doing it. I've got about 20 minutes before I need to check on Mrs. Halloran down the hall. Want me to read a little? She would think back on that moment many times in the months that followed, the strange smallness and largeness of it at once. A tired nurse near the end of a shift offering 20 minutes she didn't strictly have to spare, and an old man's face doing something complicated and grateful and almost frightened, as though he'd forgotten, over some long stretch of loneliness she couldn't yet measure, what it felt like to have somebody offer him something without being asked. "I would like that very much," Walter Voss said quietly, "if you're quite sure it's no trouble." It was, in fact, some trouble, in the small practical sense that Maggie's shift ended at 7, and she had 2 children who needed breakfast, and a husband who needed to leave for a job site by 7:30. And every minute she spent in room 412 was a minute she'd have to make up somewhere else in an already tightly rationed day. But she picked up the paperback, found her place at the top of page 81, and read for 20 minutes in a voice she didn't entirely recognize as her own, softer than her nurse voice, warmer, the same voice she used at home reading Sam's dinosaur books and Lucy's picture books about brave princesses who rescued themselves. And when she finally had to stop and go check on Mrs. Halloran, Walter Voss said, "Thank you," in a voice that had gone thick with something he was visibly working very hard to keep composed. And Maggie walked out of that room feeling like she'd been given something rather than like she'd given something away, which struck her as strange, and which she didn't have time to examine closely before Mrs. Halloran's call light went off down the hall. She came back the next night, and the night after that. And within 2 weeks it had become, without either of them ever formally naming it as a policy, a fixed and sacred part of her shift. 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, after her official rounds were finished, and before she clocked out, sitting in the hard plastic chair beside Walter Voss's bed, reading the Odyssey out loud while the hospital settled into its deepest, quietest hours, the hallway lights dimmed to half, the occasional soft beep of a monitor somewhere down the corridor, the only accompaniment to Homer's ancient Greek hexameters, translated into plain English prose. She finished the Odyssey in the 3rd week of October. Walter asked, almost shyly, if she might be willing to start something else, and she said, of course, and asked what he'd like next. And he said, after a pause, that there was a box of his late wife's books in storage that he'd have to arrange to have brought, if that wasn't too much trouble, because Eleanor had wonderful taste and he found he wanted, very badly, to hear her favorite books again in another woman's voice. Not to replace her, he was careful to clarify. Nothing could replace her, but because a house that has gone silent needs sound in it again eventually, or the person left behind starts to disappear along with the silence. Maggie had no idea, that October, sitting in a hard plastic chair reading Homer to a stranger with elegant hands and no visitors, that the box of books Walter Voss was quietly arranging to have delivered from a storage facility outside Philadelphia would arrive by way of a discreet law firm, in a van driven by a man who did not identify himself as anything other than a courier, and that the same law firm, Bregman, Voss, and Cole, quietly administered a trust worth more money than Harrow Falls' entire municipal budget for the next 40 years combined. She had no idea that the man she was reading to, a man who wore the same 3 thin cotton hospital gowns in rotation and never once asked for anything beyond his allotted care, was, under a name almost nobody in that building had ever heard, the single largest donor St. Aldrich's Memorial Hospital had ever had, and that in less than 3 months the fate of the entire wing she worked in and the jobs of everyone on it would come to depend on whether or not the friendship growing quietly in room 412 was real. The box of Eleanor's books arrived on a Wednesday in late October, delivered not by the courier van Walter had arranged, but, to Maggie's mild confusion, carried in personally by a tall, silver-templed man in an impeccable overcoat who introduced himself to the nursing station only as A friend handling some errands for Mr. Voss signed for the delivery with an illegible scrawl and left without asking to see the patient, which struck Denise Okafor, the charge nurse and Maggie's closest friend on the floor, as faintly strange, though she filed it away the way overworked charge nurses file away most small strangenesses, which is to say she mentioned it to Maggie in passing and then forgot about it by the end of the shift. Maggie did not forget about it, not entirely, but she also didn't dwell on it, because when she opened that box in room 412 and started pulling out its contents, she got distracted by what was actually inside. 24 novels, many of them worn soft at the spine from rereading, a few of them containing pressed flowers between pages, one of them a collection of Mary Oliver poems, containing on its inside cover an inscription in a woman's careful cursive that read simply, "For Walter, who needed to be told to pay attention. All my love, always, E." Maggie read that inscription silently to herself before she read it out loud to him, and something about it made her chest go tight in a way she didn't examine too closely at 11:30 at night, with 2 more patients still needing her before shift change. "She sounds like she knew you very well," Maggie said, holding up the book. "Better than anyone in my life before or since," Walter said, and there was no performance in it. No polish, just a plain and total statement of fact delivered by a man who had clearly had a great deal of time in a great deal of silence to arrive at it. "We were married 51 years. I miss her every single day in a way I did not expect grief to still feel this many years on. I thought it would soften. Instead, it simply changed shape. It stopped being a wound and became more like weather. Some days it's a light rain. Some days it's a storm that knocks the power out. But it never actually leaves Maggie, and I've stopped expecting it to." She started reading from the Oliver collection that night, one poem at a time, the way you'd offer someone small sips of water after a long thirst, and something in the rhythm of it, in the deliberate slowness poetry demands that prose doesn't, seemed to settle something in Walter that the fast plot machinery of an adventure story hadn't quite reached. He would close his eyes while she read, not asleep, she came to understand, but simply receiving the words the way a person receives sun on their face, and afterward he would often ask her to read a particular poem again, or he would sit with a specific line for a full minute before saying anything at all, turning it over like a stone in his palm. Maggie began to look forward to those 45 minutes more than she admitted to anyone, including herself, at least at first. She started coming in a few minutes before her shift some evenings, ostensibly to get a head start on her rounds, actually to poke her head into room 412 and see how Walter's day had gone before her shift had even officially begun. It was around this time, the first week of November, that Maggie made the mistake of telling Danny, over a late dinner he'd kept warm for her for the 3rd time that week, the actual reason she kept coming home closer to 8 than 7:30. "You're reading to him," Danny repeated, not unkindly, just working it over, forking at coldish pot roast while their kids' cartoons murmured faintly from the living room. "Every night, for free." "It's not for free, Danny, it's a person," Maggie said, more sharply than she meant to, tired in the particular way night shift nurses get tired, a tiredness that lives in the bones rather than just the eyes. "He doesn't have anybody. Nobody comes. Not one visitor in 5 weeks. I looked at his chart. There's a lawyer's office listed as his contact, and they don't even return the hospital's calls half the time. He's just going to lie there and die alone in a room with nothing on the walls if somebody doesn't—" She stopped herself, aware her voice had risen, aware Sam had gone quiet in the next room in that specific way. Kids go quiet when they're listening to their parents more closely than the parents realize. Danny reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the calluses on his palm rough and familiar and warm. "Hey," he said. "I didn't say don't. I said you're tired and I'm watching you get more tired every week, and I love you and I'd like my wife to still be standing upright by Christmas. That's all I said. If this is something you need to do, then we'll figure it out. I can get the kids up and going in the morning more. I already do, mostly. I just want you to tell me next time, instead of me finding out by counting up how many dinners have gone cold." Maggie had married Danny Doyle for exactly this reason, she reminded herself later that night, lying next to him in the dark, listening to him already asleep, his breathing slow and even, a man who worried about her out loud instead of resenting her silently, who made room instead of building walls. She thought about Walter, alone in room 412 with a stack of his late wife's poetry and nobody to hand it to, and thought that whatever else was true about loneliness, it was not a thing that happened only to people who deserved it. And it was not a thing, she was beginning to suspect, that Walter Voss had always been prepared to simply accept without a fight, given half a reason to hope otherwise. She didn't yet know that the reason was her. She wouldn't understand the full shape of that for another 6 weeks. While Maggie's nights were filling up with Homer and Mary Oliver and the particular contentment of watching a lonely man come slowly back to life, the days at St. Aldrich's Memorial Hospital were filling up with something considerably less peaceful, though it would be another month before that trouble found its way onto Maggie's floor. The hospital's chief executive officer, a trim, tightly wound man named Preston Cade, had been hired 2 years earlier from a regional healthcare consulting firm with a mandate, spoken plainly by the board that brought him in, to modernize St. Aldrich's finances, a word that in Preston Cade's mouth tended to mean cutting whatever could be cut and monetizing whatever could be sold. He was not by nature a cruel man, or at least he did not think of himself as one. He thought of himself as a realist in a building full of people who preferred not to look at spreadsheets, and he had spent 2 years watching those spreadsheets tell an increasingly unfriendly story. St. Aldrich's ran an aging physical plant, a payer mix skewed heavily toward Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates that hadn't kept pace with costs in a decade, and a long-term care and hospice wing that, by Preston Cade's calculations, lost the hospital just under $2 million a year, a wing full of patients who could not be discharged, could not pay their own way, and could not, in the cold arithmetic he ran every quarter for the board, be justified against the hospital's shrinking margins forever. He had raised the idea privately with the board chair, a soft-spoken retired judge named Harriet Lynn, as early as August, months before Maggie ever set foot in room 412, a proposal to lease the long-term care wing's physical space, the entire wing, including room 412, to Bellhurst Realty Group, a regional developer that wanted to convert the space into a private assisted living facility under Bellhurst's own for-profit brand, one that would selectively admit patients able to pay privately and would decline, politely but firmly, the ones who could not. The hospital's remaining long-term patients, the ones like Walter Voss with no private funds and no family advocating loudly on their behalf, would be transferred to facilities elsewhere in the county, some of them an hour or more from Harrow Falls, wherever beds happened to be available. It would, on paper, solve the wing's chronic deficit at a stroke. It would also, Preston Cade knew perfectly well even as he built the financial model, mean displacing 41 elderly and dying patients from the only community many of them had left, scattering them to unfamiliar towns in the last months of their lives, for the sake of a balance sheet. "I'm not saying I've decided anything," Preston told Harriet Lynn in that August meeting, in the careful, hedging language of a man who has, in fact, mostly decided something and is testing how much resistance he'll meet before committing publicly. "I'm saying the numbers on this wing have been unsustainable for 6 straight quarters, and I have a fiduciary obligation to this hospital's long-term survival, not just to the patients currently occupying beds in one department of it. If St. Aldrich's collapses under its own debt in 5 years, we won't be helping anybody, in that wing or any other." Harriet Lynn, who had sat on that board for 11 years and had, in her time as a judge, developed a highly practiced ear for when a person's logic and a person's conscience had quietly stopped speaking to each other, had not approved the Bellhurst proposal that August, but she hadn't rejected it outright either. She had asked Preston to keep building the financial case and bring it back to the full board before the end of the year, which meant that somewhere out on the horizon of Maggie's autumn of poetry and pot roast dinners, a clock had already started running on room 412, though nobody reading to Walter Voss in that room had the faintest idea it existed. Maggie found out about it in the vaguest possible terms, the way most hospital staff eventually find out about administrative decisions that will eventually upend their working lives, through hallway rumor, weeks before anything was official. Denise Okafor, the charge nurse, cornered her in the break room in mid-November over microwaved leftovers and said, in the flat, worried voice of someone who has seen hospitals cut corners before, "You hear the rumor about the long-term wing." "What rumor?" "That Cade wants to lease it out to Bellhurst. Turn it into one of those private memory care places, the kind that costs $6,000 a month and doesn't take Medicaid patients. If it's true, everybody currently in that wing who can't pay their own way gets shipped somewhere else. Could be Erie, could be Scranton, wherever there's an open bed, is what I heard." Denise shook her head, stirring her soup harder than the soup required. "I've been here 19 years, Maggie. I've seen budget cuts. I've never seen them talk about just emptying out a whole floor of people and shutting the door." Maggie felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the hospital's notoriously aggressive air conditioning. She thought immediately, involuntarily, of room 412, of Walter Voss with his lawyer's office that didn't call back, and his box of Eleanor's poetry, and his careful, grateful, courtly gratitude every single night for 45 minutes of a stranger's time. If the rumor was true, if the wing closed, Walter would be sent wherever a bed happened to open up, an hour away, 2 hours away, with no family to visit him there and presumably no night shift nurse willing to drive an extra hour after a 12-hour shift to keep a reading habit alive with a man she'd known less than 2 months. "That can't actually happen, can it?" Maggie asked, hearing the naivety in her own question even as she said it. "There has to be some kind of process, some kind of protection for patients who don't have anywhere else to go." Denise gave her a long, tired look, the look of a woman who had worked in American healthcare administration long enough to have had most of her assumptions about protection for the vulnerable quietly worn away, one budget cycle at a time. "There's a process," she said. "It's called a board vote. And boards vote the way the numbers tell them to vote, Maggie, especially when the guy running the numbers has already decided what he wants the vote to say." Maggie didn't say anything to Walter about it that night, not wanting to alarm a frail 81-year-old man over a hallway rumor that might come to nothing, but she found herself, for the first time since October, reading to him with a small, cold weight sitting under her sternum that hadn't been there before. And when she finished the poem and looked up, Walter Voss was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between curiosity and concern. "You seem distracted tonight, Maggie," he said. "Is everything all right at home?" "Everything's fine at home," she said, and made herself smile because it wasn't his burden to carry whatever was or wasn't coming for this hospital. "Just a long shift. Don't mind me." Walter studied her for a moment longer in that careful, precise way he had, the way of a man used to noticing things other people missed, and then, apparently deciding not to push, let it go, and asked her instead to read the poem again from the top, the one about the wild geese, because he said he thought he'd missed something in it the first time through, and she read it again, her voice steadier the second time, and did not tell him that somewhere in a downtown office 2 hours away, a man named Preston Cade was building a financial model with his room number quietly inside it. The second week of November brought Walter Voss's first visitor in the 5.5 weeks he had been a patient at St. Aldrich's, and Maggie happened to be on shift the night it happened, which was how she came to be standing at the nurse's station when a young woman walked briskly through the double doors of the long-term wing, dressed in a paint-flecked canvas jacket over business clothes as though she'd come straight from a job site, carrying a battered leather portfolio case under one arm, and asked, with the particular controlled urgency of someone who has been driving for 3 hours and is trying not to show it, which room belonged to Walter Voss. "Room 412, Maggie said, standing automatically, some instinct telling her this was not a moment to simply point down the hall and go back to her charting. "Can I ask who's visiting?" "I'm his granddaughter," the young woman said. Claire Voss Whitmore. I only just heard he was even in a hospital 3 days ago, and it took me that long to get someone at his lawyer's office to actually tell me which one." Her voice cracked slightly on the last few words, the practiced calm slipping for just a second. How is he doing? Nobody would tell me anything specific over the phone. Maggie walked her down the hall herself, filling her in the careful, general terms nurses learn to use. Stable but frail, recovering from a hip fracture and a bout of pneumonia, good spirits most days, and watched Claire's face as she absorbed each detail, the tight, worried attention of someone who clearly loved this particular old man very much, and had, for reasons Maggie didn't yet understand, been kept at arm's length from him for some unknown stretch of time. When they reached the doorway of room 412, Claire stopped for a moment, visibly steadying herself, and then walked in. "Grandpa Walt," Claire said, and her voice broke completely on the second word. Maggie, standing discreetly back in the hallway to give them privacy, watched Walter Voss's face transform in a way she had not seen it transform in 5.5 weeks of nightly visits, an unguarded flood of pure joy and relief that made him look, for just a moment, decades younger than 81. "Claire," he said, reaching both hands toward her before she'd even fully crossed the room. "Claire, my darling girl, how did you find me?" "I had to practically threaten your lawyer, Grandpa. Why didn't anyone call me? Why didn't you call me?" Claire had reached the bed by now, gripping both his hands, tears openly running down her face, the kind of tears that come from weeks of controlled worry finally released. "I've been calling the house for a month. I didn't know what to think." Walter's face folded into something apologetic and complicated and old in a way that had nothing to do with his actual age. "I didn't want to worry you in the middle of your work, sweetheart. You had that competition submission due, the museum project, and I know how much that mattered to you. And there was nothing you could have done here except sit and watch an old man recover from a hip that was always going to take its time healing regardless of who was in the room." He paused, and something quieter and more honest crossed his face. "And if I'm being entirely truthful with you, which I promised myself years ago I would always try to be, I think some part of me also didn't want your father finding out where I was before I'd decided what, if anything, I wanted to do about that." Maggie, who had begun to feel she was intruding on something private and had started to step further back down the hall, caught that last sentence anyway, and something about the careful weight Walter put on the word "father" made her pause. Filing it away without fully understanding why it mattered yet, she learned more of it 3 nights later, when Claire, who had taken a leave from her architecture firm in Philadelphia and rented a small extended-stay room in Harrow Falls so she could visit her grandfather daily, lingered in the hallway after visiting hours to thank Maggie personally. "He told me about the reading," Claire said, wrapping both hands around a vending machine coffee she clearly wasn't planning to drink, just to have something to hold. "Every night for over a month. He told me it's the first time since Grandma Eleanor died that he's actually looked forward to something. I don't know how to thank you for that. I really don't." "It's really no trouble," Maggie said, faintly embarrassed by the intensity of the gratitude. "He's a wonderful man to talk to and to read to, honestly. He listens like it matters." "He listens like everything matters," Claire said with a small, sad smile. "That's exactly who he's always been. It's part of why what happened with my father is so hard for me to make sense of, honestly, because Grandpa Walt is the most attentive, most generous man I've ever known in my life, and my dad grew up in the same house and came out somehow believing that attention and generosity are the same thing as weakness." She stopped herself, visibly deciding she'd said more than she'd intended to a stranger, however kind. "I'm sorry. That's not fair of me to unload on you. It's a complicated family thing. It's not your problem." "You don't have to apologize," Maggie said gently. "I've worked nights long enough to know families are complicated. I won't repeat anything." Claire studied her for a moment, the same careful, assessing look Maggie had noticed in Walter, and seemed to reach some decision. "My father's name is Bradley," she said. "He's my grandfather's only child. They haven't spoken, not really spoken, in almost 3 years, since my grandmother's funeral, when my dad tried to get my grandfather to sign some paperwork restructuring the family trust literally the week after burying his wife of 51 years. My grandfather asked him to leave the house that day, and as far as I know, he hasn't been back since, and my dad has spent the 3 years since telling anyone who'll listen that his father is being unreasonable and controlled by lawyers who don't have the family's best interests at heart. Claire's jaw tightened. The truth is, my grandfather doesn't trust him with a checkbook, let alone anything larger, and he's not wrong not to. But it means Grandpa Walt has spent the loneliest years of his life without either the wife he loved or, in any real sense, the son he raised, and I think that's part of why what you've been doing matters so much more than you probably realize. You gave him back something to look forward to at the end of a day. That's not a small thing to a man who otherwise doesn't have much waiting for him at the end of his days. Maggie thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, turning it over the way Walter turned over lines of poetry, and found herself, without entirely deciding to, watching more carefully after that for whatever else Walter Voss might be quietly declining to mention about his own life. She noticed, in the weeks that followed, small things she hadn't fully registered before. The particular unhurried precision with which he asked questions, as though long practiced at extracting complete information efficiently, the way the hospital's own administrators, on the rare occasions one wandered through the long-term wing, seemed subtly deferential around him in a manner that didn't track with an ordinary Medicaid patient with a fractured hip. The fact that his physician, Dr. Priya Anand, always seemed to personally review his chart herself rather than delegating it to a resident, and always seemed to linger a beat longer at his bedside than strict medical necessity required. None of it added up to anything Maggie could name. It simply sat quietly at the edge of her attention, the way the almost question had sat at the edge of her attention back in October, waiting for the moment it would finally resolve into something she could see clearly. That moment came, as it happened, on the first genuinely cold night of the year, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, when Walter Voss, 3 chapters into a novel about a lighthouse keeper that had been Eleanor's particular favorite, asked Maggie to close the book for a moment because there was something he needed to tell her, and it could not wait any longer. Maggie set the novel down on the rolling table beside his bed, a small flicker of concern moving through her, the reflexive medical red she couldn't turn off even after hours, scanning his color, his breathing, the monitor readout glowing steady and unremarkable in the dim room. "Is something wrong, Walter? Are you in pain?" "No, nothing like that," he said, and gave her a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Or rather, nothing new. "I've simply reached the point in my life, Maggie, and in this particular hospital stay, where I've realized I've been unfair to you in a small but specific way, and I find I can no longer sit here every night accepting your kindness without correcting it." He shifted himself slightly higher against his pillows, wincing at the small effort it cost his healing hip, and folded his elegant hands together on top of the blanket in a gesture Maggie had come to recognize as the physical prelude to something he considered important. "I have let you believe, these past 2 months, that I am simply an old man with no family and modest means, admitted here because there was nowhere else for me to go. That was never precisely a lie. But it was not the whole truth either, and I think you deserve the whole truth, particularly given how much of your own precious time you have poured into a stranger's evenings without ever once asking what I could offer you in return." Maggie felt something tighten in her chest, an instinct she couldn't yet name telling her to brace for something. "Walter, you don't owe me any explanation. I read to you because I want to, not because—" "Please," Walter said gently, holding up one hand, the gesture of a man used to finishing his thoughts once he'd started them. "Let me finish, because if I don't say this now, tonight, I suspect my own vanity or cowardice will find some new excuse to postpone it again, the way it has found excuses for 2 months already." He took a slow breath. "My full legal name is Walter Emerson Voss, For most of my working life, I built and ran a company called Voss Emerson Manufacturing, which later became, after we sold the manufacturing operations and I redirected the proceeds, an investment and philanthropic holding company. I am, as of this year's last audited figures, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion, though I confess I stopped tracking the exact figure with any real interest some years ago after Eleanor passed. Money interested me a great deal when I was building something. It has interested me considerably less since I was simply keeping something. The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. Maggie became aware of her own pulse in her ears and of the strange sensation of every small detail in the room, the paperback on the table, the pressed flower still tucked in Eleanor's poetry collection, the elegant, careful hands folded on the blanket rearranging themselves into a picture she hadn't let herself see clearly until this exact moment. She started and stopped, because the sentence didn't seem to want to finish itself in a way that made sense against the plain hospital gown, the shared room's flickering fluorescent bulb that maintenance still hadn't replaced, the meatloaf adjacent hospital dinner tray still sitting half-finished on the rolling table. $3 billion, she said finally, very quietly, the number sitting strangely in her mouth, too large and too abstract to attach to the man in front of her. I understand this is difficult to reconcile with the man who has been asking you to read him poetry in a public hospital room for 2 months, Walter said, something almost apologetic in his voice now. I could certainly afford private care, Maggie, a private room, private nurses around the clock, any comfort money could arrange. I chose St. Aldrich's deliberately, and I chose to be admitted under conditions that would draw no particular attention, because this hospital has mattered to me for 20 years in a way I have never once advertised, and because, if I am honest, I did not want to be treated the way people are treated once they know what I'm worth. I did not want anyone being kind to me because of what I could give them. I have had a great deal of that kind of kindness in my life, Maggie, the transactional sort, and I have found I can smell it within about 30 seconds of meeting someone. The particular over-warmth of a person who has done the arithmetic on you before they've finished shaking your hand. What you have given me these 2 months has been the other kind entirely, the kind that has nothing to do with arithmetic, and I did not want to risk losing that by telling you too soon. 20 years, Maggie repeated, latching onto the detail that had snagged in her mind. You said this hospital has mattered to you for 20 years. Walter was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone lower, rougher, carrying something Maggie hadn't heard in it before, not even during the poetry, a kind of grief with edges on it. Eleanor had her first cancer diagnosis 22 years ago, Maggie, not here. We were living outside Philadelphia at the time, and she was treated at a very good hospital there, one with all the resources our money could arrange. She survived that first diagnosis. When it came back, 11 years later, we had moved out here, to a quieter house near Harrow Falls, because Eleanor wanted her last years, whatever number of them there turned out to be. Somewhere the sky was bigger and the traffic was smaller. And when the cancer came back, this hospital, St. Aldrich's, this exact building, was what we had. It did not have the oncology equipment the Philadelphia hospital had. It did not have half the specialists. I remember sitting in a waiting room down the hall from where we are right now, watching nurses, who were clearly exhausted and clearly underpaid, do everything humanly possible with equipment I later learned was nearly 15 years past its recommended replacement date. And I remember thinking, with a kind of fury I hadn't felt in decades, that my wife might die of a resource gap rather than of her actual disease, in a country and in a life where I personally had more money sitting in accounts than this entire hospital's annual budget. He paused, and Maggie saw, for the first time in 2 months of nightly visits, actual tears standing in his cloudy blue eyes, unshed, trembling at the rim. Eleanor did die, in the end, 18 months after that recurrence. Nothing I had, no amount of money, changed that particular outcome, and I want to be honest that there is no version of this story where I bought her more time than her body actually had left to give. but in the 2 years I sat beside her bed here, I watched what the staff of this hospital did with almost nothing, and I decided, the week after her funeral, that no other family in Harrow Falls was going to watch someone they loved be treated in a building that couldn't afford modern equipment, not if I had any way of preventing it. I set up a trust, administered through my lawyers, that has anonymously funded this hospital's cancer center, its neonatal intensive care unit, and its free clinic for the last 6 years. The hospital knows the money as coming from something called the W.E. Holdings Trust. Almost nobody here knows those initials are my own. I did not want a plaque, Maggie. I did not want a wing named after me or a portrait in a lobby or a single article in a local paper. I wanted, very simply, for the next family sitting where I sat not to watch someone they loved suffer for lack of equipment that money could have solved years earlier. That is the entire reason I am, as of 6 years ago, this hospital's largest single donor. And it is also the entire reason almost nobody on this hospital's staff, including you, until about 90 seconds ago, had the faintest idea who was actually lying in room 412. Maggie sat in the hard plastic chair, the poetry collection still open on her lap to a page she had stopped seeing, and felt the entire architecture of the last 2 months rearrange itself in her mind at once. The courtly, careful old man with no visitors, the box of books delivered by a silver-templed stranger who didn't want to be seen, Dr. Anand's unusual personal attention, the deferential hush of administrators who wandered occasionally through the long-term wing. None of it had ever been what it appeared to be. And yet, she realized, sitting very still in that chair, none of the actual reading, none of the actual friendship, none of the actual 2 months of poems and lighthouse keepers and Homer's wine dark sea had been any less real for the fact that she hadn't known the whole of who she was reading them to. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked finally, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "You could have let me keep not knowing. It clearly would have been easier for you." Walter's expression shifted into something that looked almost like relief, as though this had been the exact question he'd been hoping she would ask. "Because I have just learned, Maggie, through channels I would rather not have needed, that this hospital is in considerably more financial danger than I had allowed myself to believe, and that the specific wing you and I are sitting in right now, this long-term and hospice wing, is the piece of it currently under the most direct threat. I learned 3 days ago that the board is scheduled to vote on leasing this entire floor to a private developer before the end of the year, a vote that would displace every patient here who cannot privately pay for care, myself very much included, to facilities elsewhere in the state. I cannot fix that as an anonymous trust quietly wiring money through lawyers, not fast enough, not with the discretion I've maintained for 6 years intact. If I am going to stop it, and I intend to try with everything I have left, I am going to have to stop hiding, publicly, immediately. And I did not think it was right to let you find out who I actually am by reading about it in a newspaper headline before I'd had the chance to tell you myself, in this room, the way you deserved to hear it." Maggie's mind went in rapid succession through several things at once. The cold weight she'd carried under her sternum since Denise Okafor's break room warning about Bellhurst Realty, the abstract, distant rumor she'd been holding at arm's length for 2 weeks, suddenly acquiring teeth and a timeline, and underneath both of those, something smaller and more personal, a strange grief already anticipating itself, the realization that if the wing closed, Walter Voss, billionaire or not, would be sent away to some facility an hour or 2 hours from Harrow Falls, and their nightly ritual, whatever it actually was, friendship or something even harder to name, would simply end, swallowed by geography and paperwork. "They're voting on this before the end of the year," she said slowly. "That's 3, maybe 4 weeks away." 3 weeks and 2 days, as of tonight, according to the board calendar my lawyers were able to obtain, Walter said. "I have spent the last 3 days making calls I have not made in 6 years, Maggie. Calls that will very shortly make it impossible for me to continue being an anonymous old man in a hospital gown. I wanted you to hear the truth from me directly before that happened, because you have given me something these 2 months that I did not expect to feel again in whatever years I have left, and I did not want the first thing you learned about the actual scale of my life to be a headline instead of a conversation." He reached out slowly and rested one long, elegant hand over hers where it sat on the arm of the plastic chair. "I also, if I'm entirely honest, wanted to ask whether you would be willing to help me, because I am 81 years old, recovering from a fractured hip, and considerably better acquainted with balance sheets than I am with the particular internal politics of the hospital I'm about to try to save. And you know this building and the people in it in a way that 6 years of anonymous wire transfers never taught me." Maggie sat with that for a long moment, the poetry collection still open uselessly on her lap, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with $3 billion and everything to do with the small, insistent fact that had brought her into this room in the first place, back in October, before any of the rest of it existed. A lonely person needed something, and she had been the one standing in the doorway. "Of course I'll help," she said. "Not because of the money, Walter. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it matters to you and it matters to me too. I'd have said yes if you told me you were exactly who I thought you were this morning, a lonely man with no visitors and a good taste in poetry. The billions don't change my answer. They just change what we might actually be able to do about it." Something in Walter's composed, courtly face came apart, just slightly at that. The careful control of a man who had spent decades being the person other people needed something from, encountering, apparently for the first time in longer than he could easily say. Someone who needed nothing from him at all, except that he keep existing in the world. "Eleanor would have liked you enormously," he said, his voice thick. "I want you to know that. She had a very short list of people she considered genuinely without an angle, and I think you would have made that list within about a week." They talked for another hour that night, well past Maggie's usual 45 minutes, well past the point where she should have clocked out and driven home to Danny and the kids, working through what Walter actually knew and didn't know, that Preston Cade had been building his case since August, that Harriet Lynn, the board chair, had not yet fully committed to a yes vote and might still be reachable, that Bellhurst Realty Group's proposal, for all its financial tidiness, would displace 41 patients with nowhere else guaranteed to go, and that Walter, once he stepped forward publicly as the true identity behind the W.E. Holdings Trust, would have leverage he had deliberately avoided using for 6 years, leverage he was now prepared to spend entirely, possibly for the last time, on this one specific fight. "There's something else you should know before we go any further," Walter said near the end of that long night, his voice heavier now with fatigue he'd clearly been fighting for the last 20 minutes. "Once this becomes public, Bradley will hear about it within the day, my son. And Bradley has spent 3 years telling anyone who will listen that I am being manipulated by lawyers and advisors who don't have my best interests or his inheritance's best interests at heart. The instant he learns his father is worth $3 billion and is about to spend a considerable amount of that money and public attention saving a rural Pennsylvania hospital wing instead of, say, leaving it all more efficiently to him, I expect he will arrive in Harrow Falls with a lawyer of his own and a great deal of concern, suddenly and loudly expressed, about my mental competency to be making major decisions at my age, in my condition, from a hospital bed." Walter's mouth tightened, an old, tired bitterness there that had clearly been worn smooth by years of handling. "I tell you this not to frighten you, Maggie, but because if this fight is going to happen the way I intend it to happen, it is likely to happen with my own son standing on the other side of it, and I did not want that particular ugliness to surprise you either." Maggie thought of Sam and Lucy asleep at home, of the uncomplicated, total way her own children reached for her, and felt a fresh wave of sadness for the old man in the bed in front of her, who had, by every account she'd gathered in 2 months, been an attentive and loving father and had ended up estranged from the one child he had anyway. "I'm not scared of your son, Walter," she said. "I've dealt with difficult family members in this hospital for 11 years. I can handle one more." She did not know that night just how right she would turn out to be about needing to handle him, nor how soon. Walter Voss's reintroduction to the world happened on a Thursday morning in the first week of December. Not through a press conference or a headline, though those would come within days, but through a single phone call his attorney, a measured, unflappable woman named Denise Bregman of Bregman, Voss and Cole, placed directly to Preston Cade's office requesting an in-person meeting regarding a significant matter affecting a current patient and, separately, a significant matter affecting the hospital's finances, a phrasing precise enough to make Preston's assistant call him out of a budget meeting to take it personally. Preston Cade walked into that meeting 2 days later, expecting, based on his assistant's notes, some kind of legal complaint, a malpractice concern perhaps, or an estate dispute over a patient's care, and found instead Denise Bregman seated across a conference table with a thin folder, who informed him, without preamble, that her client, currently a patient in room 412 of the long-term care wing under the name Walter Voss, was the sole beneficial owner of an entity called the W.E. Holdings Trust, and that Mr. Voss wished to inform the hospital's leadership ahead of any public announcement that he took considerable personal interest in the future of the wing currently housing him, and would like to understand, in detail, the hospital's current financial position and the specifics of any proposal involving Bellhurst Realty Group before the board's scheduled vote. Preston Cade, by his own later account to Harriet Lynn, sat in stunned silence for a period he estimated at nearly a full minute, running back through 6 years of internal hospital documents he had personally reviewed, referencing the W.E. Holdings Trust as a faceless line item in the capital budget, 6 years of assuming, without ever once questioning it, that W.E. stood for some defunct manufacturing concern or an out-of-state foundation with no further interest in local operations beyond writing checks. He had walked past room 412 himself at least twice in the last month, he would later admit, on his way to visit an entirely different patient's family for an unrelated matter, and had not spared the frail old man in the bed a second glance. "Mr. Voss would like to meet with you directly," Denise Bregman said, closing the folder, "in his hospital room, given his current mobility. He asked me to convey that he is not interested in threats, lawsuits, or public embarrassment as a first resort, and would genuinely prefer this be resolved as a conversation between people who both want this hospital to survive. But he also asked me to convey, quite plainly, that if the board proceeds with a vote to lease the long-term wing to Bellhurst Realty Group without first hearing what he has to propose as an alternative, he will make his identity and his objections extremely public, extremely quickly, in ways that I do not believe would be comfortable for anyone in this building's leadership." Preston Cade drove to St. Aldrich's directly from that meeting, forgoing his usual afternoon of calls, and appeared in the doorway of room 412 at just past 3 in the afternoon, still in his overcoat looking, Maggie would hear secondhand from Denise Okafor, who happened to be on shift, considerably less composed than the man who ran budget meetings with the calm authority of someone who had already decided every outcome in advance. "Mr. Voss," Preston said, and Maggie was told later that he'd actually extended his hand toward the bed before seeming to catch himself, unsure whether a handshake was the correct register for the moment. "I owe you an apology I don't entirely know how to phrase, and also, I suspect, a much longer conversation than we have time for in the next 20 minutes. "Sit down, Mr. Cade," Walter said, gesturing to the same hard plastic chair Maggie occupied every night. "I find bluntness saves everyone time, so let me start there. I have read the financial summary my lawyers obtained. I understand this wing runs an operating deficit of just under $2 million annually. I understand the hospital's overall margin has been under real pressure for several years, not the manufactured pressure some administrators invent to justify decisions they've already made, but genuine structural pressure from reimbursement rates and an aging facility. I am not here to tell you that pressure doesn't exist or that you are a villain for trying to solve it. I am here to tell you that I intend to solve it myself in a way that does not require putting 41 elderly and dying patients on buses to Erie and Scranton in December." Preston Cade sat down slowly in the plastic chair, and for the first time in the entire encounter, Maggie heard through Denise's retelling later that week something crack slightly in his professional composure. "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Voss, since you've asked for bluntness. I did not arrive at the Bellhurst proposal happily. I arrived at it because I ran every other option I could construct for over a year, and it was the only one that actually closed the gap without asking this hospital's other departments to absorb cuts that would have cost considerably more jobs in oncology, in the NICU, in the emergency department than the long-term wing currently employs. I'm not a person who enjoys the idea of displacing dying patients from their community for a spreadsheet. I have not slept especially well since I started seriously considering it. But I also have a hospital with 400 employees and an entire county depending on it staying solvent, and I could not find a version of solvency that didn't cost this particular wing something. Then we are, in fact, in agreement about the actual problem," Walter said. "And we disagree only about the solution, which I find considerably easier to resolve than most disagreements I've encountered in 60 years of business. What is the wing's annual operating deficit precisely to the dollar for the last audited year?" $1,840,000, Preston said. "And the deficit is driven primarily by uncompensated and undercompensated care, not by facility costs specifically. If I've read your own documents correctly." "That's correct. The physical plant is old but functional. It's almost entirely a reimbursement gap. Medicaid and self-pay patients who can't cover the actual cost of long-term and hospice care." Walter nodded slowly, as though confirming something he'd already suspected before he'd walked into the conversation, which Maggie later understood he had. "Then I would like to propose an endowment, administered independently of the hospital's general operating budget so that no future administrator can simply absorb it into other priorities during a difficult year, specifically dedicated to permanently closing that reimbursement gap for this wing, indexed to inflation, sized generously enough that this conversation never has to happen again in either of our lifetimes or in the lifetimes of whoever succeeds us. I would like my lawyers and your board's counsel to begin drafting the structure of that endowment this week, ahead of your scheduled vote, so that when the board convenes, they are voting on a fully resourced alternative rather than a hypothetical one." Preston Cade was quiet for a long moment. "May I ask why?" he said finally, "given that you have apparently funded this hospital anonymously and without any public credit for 6 years already, and could presumably continue doing exactly that indefinitely without ever having this particular conversation." Walter's answer, when it came, was not the one Preston Cade, or Maggie, hearing about it days later, expected. "Because 6 weeks ago, Mr. Cade, a night shift nurse on this very floor, started staying 45 minutes past the end of her 12-hour shift, unpaid, unasked, to read poetry to a lonely old man with no listed visitors, because she could not bring herself to walk past his door and go home. She did not know who I was. She still would have done it if I had turned out to be exactly what I appeared to be, a stranger with nothing to offer her in return. I have spent 6 years anonymously funding equipment and wings and clinics in this building because I once watched my late wife receive extraordinary care from an under-resourced staff, and I wanted other families to have what we had. But it took a woman named Maggie Doyle sitting in a plastic chair every night for 2 months to remind me that the actual asset this hospital has, the thing worth protecting above the equipment and the buildings, is the kind of person willing to give away time she does not have to a person who cannot give her anything back. I am not interested in saving a building, Mr. Cade. I am interested in making sure this hospital can keep employing people like her indefinitely, regardless of what any spreadsheet says in any given fiscal year." News of a mysterious billionaire patient took almost no time at all to travel through a building the size of St. Aldrich's, and by the following Monday, Maggie found herself the subject of a curiosity she found deeply uncomfortable. nurses from other floors finding excuses to walk past room 412, a reporter from the Harrow Falls Sentinel calling the nursing station twice in one shift asking to speak to the nurse who reads to Mr. Voss, a request Maggie declined both times, uninterested in becoming part of a story that, in her own mind, had never been about her at all. Denise Okafor ran interference on most of it, citing patient privacy at every turn, but the whispers didn't stop, and it was into that charged, gossiping atmosphere that Bradley Voss arrived, 8 days after his father's private meeting with Preston Cade, exactly as Walter had predicted he would. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a dark wool overcoat that had clearly cost more than most of St. Aldrich's staff made in a month, trailed by a lawyer in an equally expensive suit named Foster Wren, and he did not stop at the nurse's station to ask permission or directions, walking instead directly down the hall toward room 412 with the confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to ask anyone's permission for anything. Maggie, charting at the station, looked up in time to see him pass, a tall, heavy-set man in his early 50s with his father's sharp blue eyes but none of the careful, courtly gentleness that softened them in Walter, and something in his expression, a kind of already decided grievance, made her set down her pen and follow at a discreet distance, professional instinct telling her this was not a visit that should go entirely unwitnessed by hospital staff. "Dad," Bradley Voss said, pushing open the door of 412 without knocking, "what in God's name have you done?" Walter, sitting up against his pillows, regarded his son with an expression Maggie hadn't seen on him before, wary and weary at once, the specific fatigue of a parent bracing for a conversation they've had many versions of already. "Hello, Bradley. It's been 3 years. You could start with hello." "I'll start with the fact that I got a call from my broker this morning telling me Voss Emerson trust filings are being amended for the first time in 6 years, and then a second call from a reporter, Dad, asking me to comment on my father's, quote, secret decades-long philanthropy at a rural Pennsylvania hospital, which is the first I've heard that you're even in a hospital, let alone that you've apparently been sitting on $3 billion you never told me the actual scale of." Bradley's voice had risen to fill the small room, sharp and aggrieved, and Foster Wren, hovering by the door with a leather portfolio, had the look of a lawyer who had advised his client to lead with more restraint and had been overruled. "You had a stroke 2 years ago. You're recovering from a broken hip and pneumonia right now, in a public hospital, which is bizarre enough on its own for a man in your financial position, and now I'm hearing you're about to sign away tens of millions of dollars to some hospital endowment based on the advice of, what, a nurse? Someone told me you've been letting some random nurse make decisions about your estate." "Maggie Doyle has never once asked me for a single dollar, Bradley, and has never advised me on a single financial decision, a fact you would know if you had bothered to call your own father even once in the 11 days he has been in this hospital, rather than learning about it from a reporter," Walter said, his voice gone cold and precise in a way Maggie had not heard from him before. The voice, she suspected, of the man who had actually built Voss Emerson Manufacturing from nothing across 60 hard years. "I am not incompetent. I am not confused. I am 81 years old, recovering well according to my physician, and I am making a decision, with full legal counsel of my own, about a hospital that saved what dignity your mother had left in the final 18 months of her life. If you have come here to suggest I lack the mental capacity to make that decision, I would remind you that you tried this exact maneuver at your mother's funeral, Bradley, the week we buried her, and I have not forgotten it, and I am not inclined to forget it now either." Bradley's face had gone red, whether from anger or something closer to shame. Maggie couldn't quite tell from the doorway. "I was trying to protect the family's interests at a difficult time. That's not a crime, Dad." "You were trying to restructure a trust to reduce my discretionary control 6 days after I buried the only woman I have ever loved," Walter said, "and you brought a lawyer to do it, to a funeral reception, Bradley. And when I asked you to leave, you told me I was, and I quote, letting grief cloud my judgment about what mattered. I have thought about that sentence nearly every day for 3 years. I would like you to sit with it for a moment now, in this room, and consider whether it might apply rather more precisely to the man who said it than to the man it was said to. The room went silent except for the steady beep of Walter's monitor. Foster Wren shifted his weight by the door, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he'd walked in with. Bradley Voss, for his part, seemed to deflate slightly, some of the aggrieved bluster leaking out of him, replaced by something that looked, to Maggie's eye, uncomfortably close to a much younger man's hurt. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Dad," Bradley said, quieter now. "I know that's what it looks like. I know that's what it's looked like for 3 years. But you built that company from a single machine shop, and I watched you do it. 16-hour days, missed birthdays, missed everything, and you never once let me anywhere near the real decisions. Not when I was 30, not when I was 40. And now you're sitting in a public hospital, handing tens of millions of dollars to strangers, based on 2 months of knowing a nurse. And you wonder why I show up angry. I'm not angry about the money, whatever you think. I'm angry because I have spent my entire life trying to prove to you that I could be trusted with something, anything. And the first time you decide to trust somebody with something this size, it's a woman you met 6 weeks ago instead of your own son." Maggie, still standing quietly in the doorway, felt something shift in the room's emotional weather, the ugly opening confrontation giving way, unexpectedly, to something rawer and sadder underneath it. And she understood, watching Walter's face carefully, that he had heard it too. "I did not trust Maggie Doyle with money, Bradley," Walter said more gently now. "I have never once discussed my finances with her beyond what she needed to know to help me understand this hospital's politics. I trusted her with something considerably smaller, and I have come to believe, considerably rarer. 45 minutes of her evening, given away for nothing, to a stranger who could offer her nothing back. You are right that I never let you near the real decisions at Voss Emerson. That is a fair criticism, and one I have turned over more times than you know since your mother died, wondering whether I built you into a man who only knows how to ask what things are worth because I never showed you a version of worth that wasn't measured in a ledger. But you did not come here today asking how you might help this hospital, or how you might get to know your father again after 3 years, Bradley. You came here with a lawyer, asking whether I was competent on the same day you learned about the money. I would ask you to notice which question came first for you, and to sit with what that tells you, the way I've had to sit with what my own choices told your mother more than once over 51 years. Bradley Voss stood in the middle of room 412 for a long moment, his lawyer forgotten by the door, and Maggie watched something happen in his face that she had, over 11 years of nursing, learned to recognize as the particular expression of a person confronting an uncomfortable truth about themselves for the first time in front of a witness. "I need some air," he said finally, and walked past Maggie in the doorway without quite meeting her eyes, Foster Wren trailing after him with the resigned look of a lawyer whose billable afternoon had not gone according to any script he'd prepared. Maggie stepped into the room once they'd gone, checking Walter's monitor out of habit more than necessity, and found him staring at the ceiling with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with his hip or his lungs. "That went about as well as I expected it to," he said quietly, "which is to say, badly, but perhaps slightly less badly than 3 years ago." "You didn't back down," Maggie said, settling into the plastic chair. "That surprised me a little. You've been nothing but gentle since October." "Gentleness and firmness are not opposites, Maggie, whatever Bradley currently believes," Walter said. "Eleanor taught me that, actually, in the last years of her illness, when she stopped tolerating any of my attempts to manage her feelings for her and started simply telling me the truth, kindly but completely, every single time, whether I wanted to hear it or not. I was firm with my son today because being endlessly gentle with him for 52 years is precisely how we arrived at a man who leads with a lawyer instead of a hello." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't believe he's a villain, whatever this looks like from the doorway. I believe he is a deeply wounded man who has spent his whole life mistaking my money for my attention, because I was, for most of his childhood, considerably better at providing the former than the latter. And by the time I understood the difference, Eleanor was gone, and the habits between us were already 60 years calcified. Word of the confrontation reached Dr. Priya Anand within the hour by way of a concerned charge nurse, and she arrived at room 412 that evening not as a favor or out of curiosity, but with a specific professional purpose: to conduct, at Walter's own request, a full and formally documented cognitive and capacity evaluation, one that would be entered into his official medical record and made available with his consent to any attorney, family member, or board member who wished to review it. Walter had insisted on this the moment Bradley left the building, telling Maggie flatly that he did not intend to spend the next several weeks having his competency whispered about in hallways and lawyers' offices when a single afternoon of formal documentation could settle the question permanently. "I want to be extremely clear for the record," Dr. B. Anand said, an hour into the evaluation, reviewing her notes with the careful thoroughness of a physician who understood exactly how much legal weight this particular document might eventually carry, that Mr. Voss has scored in the unimpaired range on every standard cognitive assessment I have administered, that his reasoning, judgment, and memory are entirely consistent with a sharp, high-functioning man of his age and medical history, and that, in my professional opinion, any suggestion that his current medical condition impairs his capacity to make major financial or legal decisions would not be supported by any objective evidence I have gathered today. She looked up from her clipboard at Walter, a small, dry smile crossing her face. "For what it's worth, Mr. Voss, you also correctly identified all three of the more obscure trick questions I use specifically to catch people who are coached or rehearsed, which either means you are entirely unimpaired or that you have been secretly practicing cognitive assessments in your spare time, and I am inclined, based on 11 days of knowing you, to believe the former." "I have always found tests satisfying to do well on," Walter said. "It's one of the few vices age hasn't managed to take from me yet." With the formal capacity evaluation entered into his chart, and with Denise Bregman quietly circulating a copy to Foster Wren the following morning, as a professional courtesy, in the interest of everyone avoiding an unnecessary and expensive guardianship dispute that would not succeed, the ground for any competency challenge collapsed almost as quickly as it had appeared. Bradley Voss did not leave Harrow Falls immediately, however, which surprised Maggie, who had assumed, based on the tenor of that first ugly visit, that he would return to whatever city he'd flown in from and continue the fight through his lawyer at a comfortable distance. Instead, he checked into the same extended stay lodging where Claire had been staying and returned to St. Aldrich's the following afternoon alone without Foster Wren and asked the nurse's station, quietly this time, whether his father was accepting visitors. Maggie happened to be at the station when he asked, and something in his posture diminished from the day before made her set aside her professional wariness enough to answer him directly rather than simply pointing him down the hall. "He's resting, but he's awake. I think he'd want to see you, Mr. Voss, for what it's worth. He talks about you more than you'd probably guess." Bradley looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. "You're her, Maggie, the nurse." "I am. I owe you an apology," he said with visible effort. "I said some things yesterday, about you specifically, that weren't fair and that I didn't actually believe even while I was saying them. I was scared, and scared people say ugly things about whoever's closest to the thing they're scared of. I've had a day to think about it, and I don't think you've done anything to my father except be kind to him, which is apparently a rarer commodity in his life than I ever bothered to notice." "Apology accepted," Maggie said simply. "For what it's worth, he'd like to see you far more than he's willing to say out loud. He's a proud man, but he's also lonely in a way that's bigger than the loneliness of just being sick, if that makes sense. And I don't think that particular kind of lonely goes away just because his lawyers finally know his real net worth." Bradley Voss walked down the hall to room 412 that afternoon and stayed for 3 hours, considerably longer than the visit Maggie had expected, and when he emerged, his eyes were red in a way that suggested at least some of that time had involved things other than talking about trusts and endowments. He did not attend the board meeting when it finally happened, choosing instead, at his father's request, to spend that particular evening simply sitting with him instead. But he began flying back to Harrow Falls every 10 days or so after that, first tentatively, then with the growing ease of a man relearning a language he'd half forgotten he used to speak fluently. The board meeting itself was scheduled for the second Thursday of December in the small conference room adjacent to hospital administration, and in the 10 days leading up to it, Maggie watched Walter's condition take a frightening turn that had nothing to do with hospital politics and everything to do with the plain, indifferent math of being 81 years old with a heart that had already been laboring under moderate congestive failure before any of this began. He developed a low-grade fever on a Saturday that Dr. Anand initially attributed to a minor urinary tract infection, common enough in long-term care patients and easily treated with antibiotics. But by Monday, his oxygen saturation had begun dipping in a way the monitors didn't like. And by Tuesday, 2 days before the scheduled board vote, Dr. Anand called a family meeting to discuss the possibility that Walter's heart, already weakened, was struggling to keep pace with even a minor infection's added strain. Maggie was not technically part of that family meetings being reserved by hospital policy for blood relatives and designated healthcare proxies. But Claire, who had been formally added as Walter's healthcare proxy the week after her first visit, asked specifically that Maggie be allowed to sit in, telling Dr. Fresauhri, Anand plainly that Maggie understood her grandfather's day-to-day condition and his wishes better at this point than almost anyone else in the building, family included. Dr. Anand, unconventionally but not unreasonably, agreed. "I want to be honest with all of you, the way I know Mr. Voss prefers," Dr. Anand said in the small consultation room down the hall from 412, Claire on one side of the table, Bradley, freshly returned from Philadelphia, on the other, and Maggie standing quietly near the door. A UTI in an 81-year-old man with his cardiac history is not on its own an emergency. But his heart is not tolerating the added strain the way I would want it to. And if this progresses to full sepsis, which is a real possibility over the next 48 to 72 hours, we are talking about a situation that could become genuinely life-threatening very quickly. I am telling you this not to frighten you unnecessarily, but because I know there is a significant hospital board vote scheduled for Thursday, and I understand from multiple people in this room that Mr. Voss considers his personal presence at that meeting, however brief, to be important to him. I want everyone to understand the medical reality before any decisions get made about that. Bradley's jaw tightened, and for a moment Maggie saw the anxious, aggrieved man from 8 days earlier resurface, though his anger this time pointed nowhere useful, simply outward at circumstances no lawyer could argue with. "Then he doesn't go," he said. "Whatever this endowment is, whatever this vote is, it can happen without him standing up in a conference room while he's fighting sepsis. Send the lawyers. Send documents. He does not need to physically be there." "I agree with every word of that medically," Dr. Anand said carefully. "But I would gently point out that I am not the person who gets to make that particular decision, and neither, respectfully, are either of you. Mr. Voss is alert, oriented, and has already told me this morning, quite clearly, what he intends to do." They found out exactly what Walter intended to do 20 minutes later, when all three of them returned to room 412 to find him already dressed, with Maggie's help earlier that morning in an actual suit, dark charcoal wool, that Claire had quietly arranged to have brought from a tailor 2 towns over, sitting upright in a wheelchair borrowed from Central Supply rather than his hospital bed, an IV pole rigged discreetly to travel alongside him, his color pale but his eyes entirely clear and entirely determined. "I have built one company from a single machine shop and buried a wife of 51 years, Walter said, before anyone could begin arguing with him. I do not intend to let a urinary tract infection be the thing that keeps me from a conference room down the hall. Anand has agreed, under considerable protest, to accompany me herself with full monitoring equipment, and to remove me from that room the instant she judges it medically necessary, and I have agreed, in turn, to leave the moment she gives that instruction, without argument. I would like the record to show I am not being reckless. I am being efficient with whatever time I have left to spend, which strikes me, at 81, with sepsis on the near horizon, as an entirely reasonable way to spend it. Bradley opened his mouth to object again and then, visibly, stopped himself, something passing over his face that looked almost like recognition. "You're not going to be talked out of this." "I am not," Walter agreed. "But I would very much like you beside me when I go in, Bradley, if you're willing, not as my lawyer's client and not as my accountant, as my son. I find I would like that a great deal more than I have let myself want it in 3 years." Bradley Voss stood very still for a moment and then walked around the wheelchair to stand at his father's shoulder, one hand resting there, and said in a voice considerably rougher than his earlier bluster, "Let's go, Dad, let's go save your hospital." The board conference room at St. Sio. Aldrich's was not built for the scene that unfolded in it that Thursday evening. It was a plain, low-ceilinged space with a long table, a whiteboard nobody had erased since some unrelated meeting weeks earlier, and 11 folding chairs for the 11 members of the hospital board, most of them local business owners and retired professionals who had, in Harriet Lynn's careful phrase from the meeting's opening, given generously of their time to a genuinely difficult set of decisions this year. Word had spread enough by Thursday that a small crowd of hospital staff, Maggie and Denise Okafor among them, had gathered in the hallway outside, technically not permitted in the room itself but close enough to hear through the prop door, along with, to Preston Cade's visible discomfort, a reporter from the Sentinel who had gotten wind that something unusual was happening and had simply shown up. Preston Cade presented first, walking the board through 18 months of financial modeling with the flat, careful competence of a man who had done this exact presentation in his head 100 times and had never once expected to be presenting an alternative to it. He laid out the Bellhurst Realty proposal cleanly, without either overselling or undermining it, a fact Maggie noted with some surprise, having half expected him to fight for the plan he'd spent over a year building. When he finished, Harriet Lynn turned to Denise Bregman, seated beside a wheelchair positioned at the end of the table, IV pole and portable monitor beside it, Dr. Anand standing quietly just behind with a hand resting near the equipment, ready to intervene at the first concerning number. "Mr. Voss," Harriet Lynn said, "the board understands you'd like to address us directly, and given your current condition, we're prepared to keep this as brief as you need it to be." Walter Voss straightened himself in the wheelchair, and Maggie, watching from the hallway through the gap in the door, saw him gather whatever remaining strength his body had left and pour all of it into the next several minutes. 11 of you have given a great deal of unpaid time this year, wrestling with a problem that has no comfortable answer, Walter began, his voice thinner than it had been even a week earlier, but steady. "I am not here to criticize any of you or Mr. Cade for the year of work that led to tonight's proposal. I am here because I believe there is a better answer, one that does not require 41 of your neighbors, people some of you have known your entire lives, to be relocated in the final months of their lives to towns an hour or two away from every friend and family member they have left. My legal counsel has, over the last 10 days, structured an independent endowment, the Eleanor Voss Continuing Care Fund, named for my late wife, who received exceptional care from this hospital's long-term wing during the final 18 months of her life. This endowment will be funded at $40 million, invested conservatively, generating sufficient annual return to permanently close this wing's reimbursement gap in perpetuity, administered by an independent board of trustees that will include hospital representation but will not be subject to annual budget pressure or any single administrator's discretion. I would like to be equally clear that this endowment comes with no conditions on hospital operations, no seat for me or my family on its governing board beyond an initial advisory role during transition, and no expectation of public recognition beyond what the board itself judges appropriate. I have spent 6 years funding this hospital anonymously and would have been entirely content to continue doing so indefinitely. I am stepping into the light tonight only because anonymity was no longer fast enough to solve this particular problem in the time this particular problem allowed. A murmur moved through the room, audible even in the hallway. Harriet Lynn, composed as ever, asked the obvious question. Mr. Voss, forgive the bluntness this deserves, but the board has a fiduciary responsibility to verify any commitment of this scale before it factors into tonight's vote. Can your counsel confirm the funds are committed, not merely proposed? The $40 million is already sitting in an escrow account established Tuesday morning, subject to release upon this board's vote to reject the Bellhurst proposal and formally accept the endowment structure my counsel has provided each of you in writing, Denise Bregman said, sliding a folder to each board member. I would add, for the board's full transparency, that Mr. Voss's son, Bradley Voss, has independently pledged an additional $5 million toward a capital modernization fund for the wing's physical equipment, a commitment he made this week of his own volition. Every head in the room turned, Maggie's included from her spot in the hallway toward Bradley, who stood near his father's wheelchair looking faintly startled at being the center of attention, clearly more comfortable in the shadow of the moment than in it directly. My father built something worth believing in, Bradley said, his voice rougher than she'd heard it even in the private moments of the past week. And I spent a long time resenting the fact that I never got close enough to it to understand what it actually was. I'd like to be part of fixing this, in whatever way is useful, rather than part of the reason it doesn't get fixed. Preston Cade, when Harriet Lynn turned to him for his professional assessment, took a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried something Maggie hadn't heard in it during their earlier private meeting, something that sounded, to her ear, almost like relief at being handed a version of the future he could actually feel good about building. From a purely financial standpoint, this endowment structure resolves the wing's operating deficit more durably than the Bellhurst lease would have, and it does so without displacing a single current patient or eliminating a single current position. I would be, frankly, derelict in my own duty if I recommended the board choose short-term certainty over this alternative, now that it exists as a genuine option rather than a hypothetical one. I move that the board decline the Bellhurst Realty proposal and accept the terms of the Eleanor Voss Continuing Care Fund as presented. The vote, when Harriet Lynn called it, was unanimous, 11 hands raised in a low-ceilinged conference room that had, 20 minutes earlier, seemed destined to end 41 people's stay in the only community many of them had left. Maggie, standing in the hallway with Denise Okafor's hand gripping her arm tightly enough to leave marks, found herself crying without entirely deciding to, and looked over to see Claire doing the same thing, and Bradley Voss blinking hard at the ceiling in the particular way men of his generation blink when they are trying very hard not to be seen crying and failing anyway. It was in the middle of the small, relieved commotion that followed the vote, board members rising to shake hands, Preston Cade crossing the room to personally thank Walter, that Dr. Annan's voice cut through everything else, sharp and urgent in a way it had not been all evening. His oxygen's dropping. We need to move now. What followed happened very fast, in the way medical emergencies always happen fast, a blur of motion that Maggie, despite 11 years of nursing training, telling her exactly what each step meant, experienced from the outside for once, as a frightened friend rather than a professional. Dr. Anand and a rapid response team materialized within 90 seconds, wheeling Walter directly from the conference room to the intensive care unit 2 floors up, calling for blood cultures and broad-spectrum antibiotics and a cardiology consult before the wheelchair had even cleared the doorway, the celebratory murmur of the boardroom collapsing instantly into the clipped, urgent shorthand of a hospital staff moving a critically ill patient. Claire ran alongside the gurney they transferred him to at the elevator, gripping his hand, and Bradley, for the first time since Maggie had met him, looked entirely lost. A large man suddenly with nothing useful for his hands or his considerable resources to do. Maggie was not assigned to the ICU. It was not her floor, not her patients, not, strictly speaking, any part of her job to be standing in that waiting room at 11 o'clock at night, 4 hours after her shift technically ended, still in her scrubs, having called Danny to tell him she didn't know when she'd be home and hearing him say, without a single question, "Go, I've got the kids. Call me when you know something." But she stood there anyway, in the ICU family waiting room with its uncomfortable vinyl chairs and its muted television playing a rerun. Nobody was watching, alongside Claire and Bradley, because 11 years of nursing had taught her that some kinds of care don't end when a shift does, and because the man in that unit 2 floors down had spent 2 months teaching her, one poem at a time, that showing up was very often the entire point. The sepsis, when the blood cultures confirmed it around 1 in the morning, was serious. Dr. Anand told them in the careful, measured voice physicians use when a situation has moved from concerning to genuinely grave, an infection that had spread from Walter's urinary tract into his bloodstream, taxing a heart already weakened by years of moderate failure, his blood pressure dropping despite fluids, his kidneys beginning to show early signs of strain under the combined assault. "I want to be honest with you both, the way I know he'd want me to be," Dr. Anand said, sitting across from Claire and Bradley in the family room at nearly 2 in the morning, Maggie standing quietly by the door. "The next 12 hours are going to tell us a great deal. We are doing everything modern medicine allows for a man his age with his cardiac history. I cannot promise you an outcome. I can promise you that if effort and expertise can carry him through this team will provide both, without reservation." Claire, exhausted and tear-streaked, asked the question Maggie could see forming behind Bradley's eyes as well, but that he seemed unable to make himself say out loud. "Is he going to die tonight, Dr. Anand? I need you to just tell me plainly, please." "I don't know," Dr. Anand said, with the honesty Walter himself would have demanded. "I would be lying to you if I told you either yes or no with any real confidence right now. I can tell you he is fighting hard, that his numbers over the last hour have stabilized slightly rather than continuing to fall, and that if I were placing a bet, which I try very hard never to do in this job, I would say the next few hours are more likely to go his way than not. But I want you both prepared for either outcome, because that is the honest medical reality of where we are at 2 in the morning, and I don't believe in telling families anything less than the truth, especially about a man who has spent the last several weeks insisting on nothing but the truth himself." The 3 of them sat together through the rest of that night, in a silence broken only occasionally, Claire eventually falling into an exhausted half-sleep against the vinyl armrest sometime after 3, Bradley pacing the small waiting room in long, restless loops that eventually wore a visible path in Maggie's attention, if nowhere else, until, somewhere past 4 in the morning, he stopped pacing and sat down heavily in the chair beside her. "Can I ask you something?" Bradley said, his voice low so as not to wake Claire. "And I want an honest answer, not a comforting one. You've spent more actual time with my father these last 2 months than I have in the last 3 years combined. Do you think he's happy? Whatever happens tonight. Has he been happy these last weeks? Or is that just a story I'm telling myself because it would make me feel less guilty about the 3 years I wasn't here?" Maggie considered the question carefully before answering, because she understood it was not a question Bradley was asking casually, and it deserved more than a reflexive kindness in return. "I think your father has been lonelier than almost anyone I've met in 11 years of nursing," she said finally. "I think losing your mother took something out of him that never fully grew back. And I think 3 years without you in his life made that loneliness worse in a way he was too proud to ever say to you directly. But I also think these last 2 months, reading to him every night, watching him with Claire, watching him with you this week, even when the 2 of you were shouting at each other in that hospital room, that he has been more alive than I suspect he's let himself be in a very long time. He told me once that grief doesn't go away, it just changes shape, stops being a wound, and becomes weather. I think what's happened these last 2 months is that the weather's been better than it was. Not perfect, not without pain, but better. And I don't think that's a story you're telling yourself to feel less guilty, Bradley. I think it's just true, and I think you being here this week and the endowment and all of it is at least part of why it's true. Bradley Voss put his face in his hands for a long moment, his shoulders shaking silently, and Maggie sat quietly beside him without saying anything further, because some moments don't need any more words added to them, and this, she understood, was one of them. Walter Voss's fever broke at 6:14 in the morning, a fact Maggie would remember with strange precision for the rest of her life, because Dr. Annan came into the waiting room herself to deliver it rather than sending a resident, her scrubs rumpled from a night without sleep, her face carrying the specific exhausted relief of a physician who has spent 8 hours genuinely unsure which way a night would break. "His numbers are turning," she said, and Maggie watched Claire come fully awake in an instant, watch Bradley's head snap up from his hands. His blood pressure's stabilizing, his oxygen's climbing back on its own, and the antibiotics appear to be doing exactly what we needed them to do. I want to be cautious. We are not out of the woods completely. The next 48 hours still matter enormously. But if you're asking me whether I think he's going to survive this particular night, I am, for the first time since about 1 this morning, willing to say yes. Claire began crying again. Differently this time, and Bradley Voss, a 52-year-old man who had walked into this hospital 11 days earlier, flanked by a lawyer and an accusation, sat down heavily on the floor of the ICU waiting room and put both hands over his face and simply wept, unguarded, unwatched, except by 2 women who had, in the space of a single terrifying night, become something closer to family than either of them had expected. Walter Voss spent 9 more days in the ICU and step-down unit recovering from the sepsis before he was well enough to be moved back to a room on the long-term wing, a wing that was, by the time he returned to it in the 3rd week of December, already visibly different. Fresh paint on the walls that Preston Cade had authorized from an emergency maintenance fund the moment the endowment vote passed, new call button systems installed ahead of a modernization timeline that had been quietly accelerated, and taped with obvious care to the wall of what had once been the emptiest room on the hall, a hand-drawn card from Sam and Lucy Doyle, who had asked their mother, upon hearing the whole story finally, whether they could make something for the man you read to, a crayon drawing of a lighthouse that Maggie suspected correctly would mean more to Walter than almost anything else in the room. "Your children made this," Walter said. The first night Maggie was back on shift after his return, holding the drawing carefully in his still weakened hands, studying it with the same careful attention he gave everything. "For me." "They've heard a lot about you," Maggie said. "Sam wanted to know if billionaires can still like dinosaurs. Lucy wanted to know if you had a castle. I told them you had something better than a castle, which is a very good taste in poetry and an unreasonable number of good books." "I would very much like to meet them, if you and your husband would ever be willing," Walter said. "Not," he added quickly with a small, wry smile that Maggie recognized now as entirely his own, unhidden, as some grand billionaire gesture, simply as an old man who would like to thank 2 children properly for a very good lighthouse. They came the following Saturday, Sam and Lucy both scrubbed and nervous and enormously excited, Danny hovering behind them with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who had, over the past 2 months, absorbed a great deal of strange news about his wife's patient in installments, and was only now fully processing the scale of all of it at once, standing in a hospital room with a man worth $3 billion who was, at that particular moment, entirely occupied with asking Sam detailed and genuinely curious questions about the specific dietary habits of the ankylosaurus. Lucy, less interested in dinosaurs, had brought a second drawing, this one of the castle Walter apparently didn't have, in case you want one anyway. And Walter accepted it with a solemnity that made Lucy beam with the particular pride of a 6-year-old who has been taken completely seriously by an adult. "Your wife," Walter said to Danny quietly, near the end of that visit, while the children examined the room's admittedly unimpressive television with the frank disappointment of kids used to better screens at home, has given me back something in these last 2.5 months that I did not expect to feel again in whatever time I have left. I want you to know that I understand precisely what it cost her, in sleep, in time with you and these 2 extraordinary children, and I do not take any of it lightly. I have tried in whatever ways she'll allow me to make sure it was worth what it cost her family. I hope you'll let me continue trying." Danny Doyle, who was not a man given to long speeches, considered this for a moment and then said simply, "She'd have done it, whether you were worth $3 or $3 billion, Mr. Voss. That's just who she is. But I appreciate you saying it. And for what it's worth, I think whatever this turned into, it's done something good for her too. She comes home lighter than she used to some nights. I hadn't seen that in a while, if I'm honest, before all this." The story of the endowment and of the anonymous donor behind it broke fully into public view the week before Christmas, when the Harrow Falls Sentinel ran a front-page feature under the headline, "Local Hospital's Mystery Benefactor Revealed. Voss Family Saves Long-Term Care Wing," a story that, to Preston Cade's private relief and Walter's private discomfort, focused considerably more on the hospital's future and considerably less on the exact scale of the Voss fortune than either man had feared. The reporter, a persistent young woman named Tony Alvarez, who had been trying to get an interview with the nurse who reads to Mr. Voss for weeks, finally got her sit down with Maggie only after Walter personally asked her to consider it, arguing gently that the story deserved to include the actual heart of it, rather than only the financial mechanics. "I want to be careful how I talk about this," Maggie told Tony Alvarez in an interview conducted, at Maggie's insistence, in the diner 2 blocks from her house rather than at the hospital, "because I don't want it to sound like I did something calculated, some kind of strategy that paid off. I read to a lonely man because he was lonely and I had 45 minutes and a voice. That's genuinely the entire story, from where I was standing. Everything after that, the endowment, the board vote, all of it, that's Walter's story and his family's story, not really mine. I just happened to be sitting in the chair when it started." "But you kept coming back?" Tony pressed gently. "Night after night, for months, unpaid, when you had 2 kids and a full-time job and every reasonable excuse to stop after the first week. That's not nothing, Mrs. Doyle. Most people don't do that." Maggie thought about that for a long moment before answering, turning it over the way she'd watched Walter turn over lines of poetry across an entire autumn. "I think most people would, actually, if they let themselves really see the person in the room the way I got to see Walter," she said finally. "I think the hardest part isn't the kindness itself, it's making yourself stop and actually look at somebody long enough to notice what they need instead of walking past because you're tired, and it's the end of a long shift and it would be so much easier to just go home. I got tired plenty of nights. I almost didn't go in a few times. I'm not a saint, Tony, I promise you that. I just kept choosing to look, and it turned out looking was the whole thing. That's not a strategy. That's just paying attention to the person in front of you, which I think most of us are actually capable of. If we're honest, we just don't always make ourselves do it." The article ran 2 days before Christmas, and by New Year's, a modest but steady stream of get-well cards, hand-drawn pictures from local school children, and casseroles from Harrow Falls residents who had never met Walter Voss but felt, in the particular way small towns absorb a good story, that his fight had somehow become the whole town's fight, began arriving at St. Aldrich's, addressed simply to Mr. Voss, room 412. So many of them that the nursing station eventually set up a dedicated bin for them, and Walter, still weak but recovering steadily through the last week of December, insisted on personally reading every single one, dictating short thank you notes to Claire, who typed them and mailed them back with the same careful attention Walter brought to everything else in his life. Christmas itself fell on a Thursday that year, and Maggie had not expected to work it. her rotation having landed on the holiday off for the first time in 3 years. But she found herself, around 6 in the evening, unable to simply stay home and drove to St. Aldrich's anyway, off the clock, carrying a small wrapped copy of a poetry collection she'd found at the used bookstore in town, a companion volume to the Mary Oliver collection they'd finished reading together 3 weeks earlier. She found Walter sitting up in bed, Claire beside him, Bradley, who had flown in the night before and would fly back the day after New Year's, dozing in the recliner in the corner after what was apparently a long day of family conversation, neither of them fully described to her, and a small string of battery-powered lights that Claire had strung along the window ledge, giving the room, for the first time since Maggie had met him, something that looked genuinely, unmistakably like a home rather than a hospital. "Maggie," Walter said, his face lighting with the particular warmth she'd come to associate specifically with her own arrivals, distinct from any other visitor's welcome. "You didn't need to come. It's your holiday." "I wanted to," she said simply, and handed him the wrapped book. "Merry Christmas, Walter." He opened it carefully, the way he opened everything, and when he saw the title, something moved across his face that was equal parts delight and grief, the particular complicated emotion of a gift that lands exactly right, precisely because it understands what someone has lost as well as what they've found. "Eleanor would have chosen exactly this one next," he said quietly. "How did you know?" "I didn't. Not really," Maggie admitted. "I just thought about what she'd have liked, based on everything you've told me about her these last months, and this was the one that felt right. I could be wrong." "You are not wrong," Walter said, his voice thick. "You have not been wrong about a single thing since the day you walked into this room and turned on a light I didn't ask you to turn on. I want you to know, Maggie, sitting here on Christmas with my son in that recliner and my granddaughter beside me, and a room full of cards from strangers I've never met, that I did not expect, at 81 years old recovering from sepsis, to be given an entire second chance at the parts of a life I thought had already finished. I thought Eleanor's death had closed the door on the part of my life that involved being truly known by anyone. You proved me wrong about that, one poem at a time, without ever once trying to prove anything at all. That is, I have come to believe the rarest kind of gift a person can give another person, to change their entire life, while insisting the whole time that you were doing nothing remarkable at all." Maggie sat with him for 2 hours that Christmas evening, reading the first few poems from the new collection, while Claire and Bradley listened quietly from their corners of the room. And when she finally left, close to 9, Danny and the kids waiting for her at home with a plate warmed twice over, she drove through Harrow Falls' modest, twinkling Christmas lights, feeling something she found difficult to name precisely. Gratitude tangled up with exhaustion, tangled up with a kind of quiet, settled joy. She hadn't expected a hospital room to be capable of producing on a holiday, and thought, not for the first time, that she had gone looking for nothing more than an ordinary shift 11 weeks earlier and had found, instead, something closer to the actual center of what she believed a good life was supposed to be built from. Not everything in the weeks that followed was as gentle as that Christmas evening, and Maggie would have been the first to say that any version of this story that pretended otherwise wasn't being honest. In the second week of January, a representative from Bellhurst Realty Group, apparently unwilling to simply let a lost proposal go quietly, sent a letter to the hospital board suggesting, in carefully lawyered language, that the endowment vote had been influenced by undue personal relationships between hospital staff and the donor in question, a thinly veiled reference to Maggie that named her directly by her second paragraph, questioning whether a nurse's unusual personal closeness to a patient of Walter Voss's wealth and influence represented an ethical conflict the hospital's own policies should have caught and addressed before any vote was allowed to proceed. The letter found its way, as these things do, into hospital administration first, then into a brief but genuinely frightening meeting between Maggie, Denise Okafor, and the hospital's director of human resources, a careful, thorough woman named Yolanda Pruitt, who had, Maggie could tell from the moment she sat down, been given the unenviable task of investigating whether an 11-year nurse with a spotless record had somehow crossed a line by reading poetry to a dying man. "I want you to understand this isn't personal, Maggie, and it isn't punitive," Yolanda said, sliding a folder across the table that contained, Maggie saw with a sinking feeling, printed timesheets alongside the Bellhurst letter. "But we have to take any formal ethics complaint seriously, particularly one involving a donor of this magnitude and a board vote of this consequence. I need to ask you directly, did you ever discuss hospital finances, board politics, or the specifics of the Bellhurst proposal with Mr. Voss before his identity became known to hospital leadership?" Maggie felt her heart pounding. The particular fear of a person who has done nothing wrong and understands, from long experience, that doing nothing wrong is not always sufficient protection against being made to feel as though you have. "I told him about the rumor," she said honestly, because she had promised herself, sitting in that chair, that she would answer every question with complete honesty, regardless of what it cost her, the same principle Walter himself lived by. "In November, before I knew who he was, our charge nurse mentioned a rumor about the wing possibly closing, and I was upset about it, and it showed. And Walter asked me directly if something was wrong, and I told him there was a rumor going around that the long-term wing might close. I did not know at that point that he had any power to do anything about it. I thought I was simply being honest with a friend about why I seemed distracted. I did not solicit his help. I did not know his identity for another 2 weeks after that conversation." Yolanda made a careful note, her expression unreadable. "And after his identity became known to you, did you advise him on hospital strategy, on how to approach the board, on anything related to the vote itself?" "No," Maggie said firmly. "I want to be completely clear about that because it matters. Walter asked me, the night he told me who he was, whether I'd be willing to help him understand this hospital's internal politics, because I know this building and its people better than his lawyers do. I told him I would help him understand the culture here, who the good people were, how decisions actually got made day to day on the ground, not because of his money, but because that's the kind of question a friend answers for a friend. I never once discussed specific numbers, specific board members' votes, or specific strategy for the Bellhurst situation. I did not attend the board meeting in any official capacity. I was not consulted on the endowment structure, which was designed entirely by his attorneys. If you're asking whether my friendship with Walter Voss might have colored my professional objectivity as his nurse, I think that's a fair question to ask of any nurse who becomes close to a patient over months. And I'd answer it by saying, I gave him the same clinical care I give every patient on that hall, and reviewed my own charting with Denise this morning specifically because I anticipated this question might come, and I'm happy to have any other nurse or supervisor review it as well. Denise Okafor, who had sat quietly through the exchange until this point, spoke up. I supervised Maggie's charting on Mr. Voss throughout his admission, Yolanda, and I wanted on record that her clinical documentation was, if anything, more thorough than average, not less, which is often exactly the opposite of what happens when a nurse gets too personally close to a patient to see them clearly anymore. If there's a conflict here, it's not one that shows up anywhere in the actual clinical record, and I've looked. The investigation, which lasted 11 uncomfortable days, during which Maggie continued working her regular shifts under a cloud she found genuinely exhausting to carry, concluded with a formal finding that no ethics violation had occurred, that Maggie's actions throughout Walter Voss's admission were consistent with, and in fact exemplary of, the hospital's own stated values around patient-centered care, and that the timing of the Bellhurst letter, arriving exactly when it did, suggested motivations considerably less concerned with hospital ethics than with reopening a deal the board had already voted to reject. Preston Cade, to his credit, wrote a short internal memo, later shared with Maggie by Yolanda herself, stating plainly that Nurse Doyle's conduct throughout this entire matter represents precisely the kind of care this hospital should aspire to model, and any suggestion otherwise reflects poorly only on the party making it. Walter, when he learned what had happened, days after the fact because Maggie had deliberately kept it from him during the investigation itself. Not wanting to add stress to a man still recovering from sepsis was angrier than she had ever seen him, a cold, controlled fury that reminded her sharply of the version of him that had faced down his own son. "They investigated you," he said, his voice tight. "Over a letter from a real estate company angry about losing a deal, and you didn't tell me. You were recovering from sepsis, Walter. I wasn't going to hand you a fight to get upset about while your heart was still recovering from the last one. Maggie." He said her name the way he said important things, slowly, with full weight behind it. "I have spent 6 years hiding behind anonymous trusts, specifically so that money would never distort the relationships in my life. And the first time it very nearly did, very nearly cost you something you didn't deserve to lose, I was the last person told. That is not acceptable to me. I want you to promise me, going forward, that if anything I am connected to ever threatens to cost you or your family anything at all, you will tell me immediately so that I can use whatever I have, money, lawyers, whatever is required, to make sure it never touches you unfairly again. You gave me back 2 months of my life I thought I'd already lost. I will not sit quietly while the consequences of that generosity land on you instead of me." Maggie moved more than she wanted to admit, promised him she would, and meant it, and the two of them sat together that evening in a silence that had, by that point in their friendship, become as comfortable and as necessary as any of the poems they'd read aloud across the preceding months. Walter's recovery, once the sepsis cleared and the endowment fight settled into its quieter, legal phase of formal paperwork and trustee appointments proceeded steadily but slowly through January and into February. His hip healing on the unhurried timeline hips insist on in a man of 81, his heart function stabilizing under a revised medication regimen Dr. Anand adjusted twice more before landing on a combination that seemed to actually agree with him. He grew strong enough by the middle of February to transfer from bed to wheelchair without assistance, then from wheelchair to walker, a milestone celebrated in room 412 with what Maggie privately considered an excessive and touching amount of ceremony, Claire having brought a small cake from the bakery on Main Street, Bradley having flown in specifically for the occasion, both of them cheering as though Walter had crossed an Olympic finish line rather than walked 12 unsteady feet down a hospital corridor with a nurse on either side. It was during this same stretch of slow, steady progress that Claire Voss Whitmore, the architect granddaughter who had first arrived at St. Aldrich's in a paint-flecked jacket clutching a portfolio case, approached Preston Cade with an idea she'd been quietly developing since the night of the board vote, that the newly funded and newly renovated wing deserved not just fresh paint and updated equipment, but an actual redesign, informed by the 11 days she'd spent essentially living in its hallways, watching what worked and what didn't for patients and families, navigating some of the hardest weeks of their lives. Preston, who had come to genuinely respect Claire's sharp, practical intelligence over the preceding weeks, agreed to bring her proposal to the board, and by March, ground had broken on a modest but meaningful renovation of the wing's common areas, a family lounge with real windows and real light, where visitors could sit with dying relatives outside the confines of a single hospital room, a small reading nook, Claire's idea entirely, tucked into a sunlit corner near the nurses' station, stocked with donated books and comfortable chairs, intended explicitly for exactly the kind of quiet, unhurried company that had started this entire chain of events in the first place. "I want to name it something specific," Claire told Maggie one afternoon in March, unrolling a set of preliminary drawings across the overbed table in room 412, while Walter, sitting up in a chair by the window now rather than the bed, watched with obvious pride. Not after Grandpa. He'd never allow that, and honestly, I don't think it's really his story to have his name on even though his money paid for it. I want to call it the quiet hour room, after what you did every night for 2 months before anybody in this building had any idea who you were doing it for." Maggie felt her throat tighten unexpectedly at the suggestion. "Claire, I don't need anything named after me. I really didn't do this for recognition." "I know you didn't," Claire said. That's exactly why it should carry your name in spirit, even if we don't put your actual name on a plaque, which I already know you'd hate. The Quiet Hour Room, a place for whoever's willing to give somebody an unpaid, unglamorous 45 minutes at the end of an exhausting day, because that turned out to be worth more to this hospital than anything my grandfather's money could buy on its own. The money fixed the budget. You're the reason the budget was worth fixing in the first place. The board approved the name in April, and the small reading nook, modest by the standards of a $40 million endowment, but enormous in what it represented, opened quietly on a Tuesday afternoon with no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press release, simply a small brass plaque reading, "The Quiet Hour Room," for those willing to stay a little later, mounted beside the door, and a stack of donated books on the shelves that included, prominently displayed at Claire's insistence, a battered paperback copy of The Odyssey and the entire collected works of Mary Oliver. Walter Voss was discharged from St. Aldrich's Memorial Hospital on the second Friday of April, 7 months after his admission, walking out of the building on his own 2 feet with a cane for balance, rather than the wheelchair he'd needed through most of the winter. Claire on one side of him and Bradley on the other, an entire contingent of nursing staff, Maggie and Denise Okafor among them, gathered in the lobby to see him off. It was not, by any account, a typical hospital discharge. Preston Cade himself came down to shake his hand. Dr. Anand hugged him, which she told Maggie afterwards she almost never did with patients, and made an exception for. And when Walter reached the sliding glass doors at the hospital's main entrance, sunlight streaming in across the lobby floor for the first time in 7 months without a hospital window's glass and blinds between him and it, he stopped, turned back to the small crowd that had gathered, and said the thing that Maggie would remember, of everything he said in those 7 months, most clearly for the rest of her life. I came into this building in October believing I had already lived the best parts of my life, and that whatever remained was simply going to be a quiet, well-funded waiting room before the end. I am walking out of it in April having learned that is almost never true, for anyone at any age, as long as there is a single person left willing to sit down next to you and pay attention. I built a company once. I built a fortune, for whatever that turns out to be worth in the end. But I did not build anything in 81 years that mattered more than the 45 minutes a night a nurse named Maggie Doyle gave me for free, expecting absolutely nothing in return. And I hope every person in this building understands, long after I'm gone and this story is old news, that the actual currency this hospital runs on was never really money at all. It was always just this, people staying a little later than they had to, for somebody who needed it. Walter did not disappear from Maggie's life once he was discharged, as she had half feared he might, once he no longer needed a nurse and could simply return to whatever version of his old life awaited a recovered billionaire outside a hospital's walls. He moved, at Claire's gentle insistence, into a smaller, single-story house on the edge of Harrow Falls itself, rather than returning to the larger property outside Philadelphia, where Eleanor had spent her final years. A decision he explained to Maggie one evening, several weeks after his discharge, over coffee at her own kitchen table, an image she still found faintly surreal, one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania sitting at her scratched, second-hand kitchen table while Sam quizzed him about whether the Ankylosaurus could have defeated a Tyrannosaurus in a hypothetical fight. "I could live anywhere in the world, Maggie," Walter said, once Sam had been persuaded to bed and Lucy had fallen asleep against Danny's shoulder in the next room. "I have houses I haven't visited in years, sitting empty, maintained by staff I barely know the names of, but I found, lying in that hospital bed for 7 months, that the thing I had actually been missing, long before the hip fracture, long before any of this, was not scenery or square footage. It was simply people who would notice if I stopped showing up. Harrow Falls noticed this winter in a way no city ever did. This town noticed when I nearly died, and it noticed when I came home, and it will notice, I suspect, on ordinary Tuesdays for the rest of however many years I have left, in exactly the way I want to be noticed. That's worth more to me now than any view." He became, over that spring and summer, a quiet fixture of Harrow Falls in a way the town had never quite had before. Not flashy, not performative, simply present, a regular at the diner on Route 9, where he'd taken, at Maggie's suggestion, to eating a weekly breakfast at the counter and had become genuinely close with several of the regulars there, none of whom, for months, had any idea they were sharing a counter with a billionaire, because Walter, true to form, never once mentioned it unless directly and specifically asked. A fixture at Sam's Little League games starting that summer, having quietly arranged, through the same discreet channels that had funded the hospital for years, for new uniforms and equipment for the entire under-10 league, once he learned half the kids were playing in gear held together with athletic tape, and, most consistently of all, a fixture in Maggie's own living room on Sunday afternoons, where the reading ritual that had started in a hospital room continued, transformed now into something closer to an ordinary friendship between an old man and a family who had, without either side entirely planning it, adopted each other. Bradley Voss's reconciliation with his father, tentative and imperfect in the early months, deepened across that spring and summer into something neither of them described dramatically, but both of them, in separate conversations with Maggie, described as the most important development of their respective adult lives. He began flying to Harrow Falls every 2 weeks rather than every 10 days. Then, by summer, had quietly relocated a significant portion of his own business dealings to be run remotely from a small office he rented above the hardware store on Main Street, close enough to walk to his father's house most evenings. He and Walter did not become instantly perfect with each other, and there were, Maggie knew from occasional glimpses, still hard conversations between them about the 52 years that had led to their estrangement in the first place. Conversations that could not simply be undone by one dramatic winter of crisis and reconciliation. But they were having those conversations now, in person, regularly, instead of not having them at all, which both men eventually agreed was the entire difference that mattered. Claire's career took an unexpected turn as well, the modest renovation of St. Aldrich's long-term wing leading, by word of mouth among hospital administrators across 3 counties, to a small but growing specialty practice designing humane, dignity-centered spaces for long-term and hospice care facilities, work she described to Maggie more than once as the first professional project she'd ever undertaken that felt like it was actually her own idea rather than an inherited expectation, built from watching her grandfather nearly die in a room that could have been kinder to him, and deciding to spend her career making sure other rooms in other hospitals were kinder to other families. Preston Cade, for his part, remained CEO of St. Aldrich's Memorial Hospital, and Maggie came to understand, over the months that followed, that he had never actually been the villain of this story, so much as a man doing an impossible job with an impossible set of constraints, and that the endowment's arrival had allowed him to finally do that job in a way that let him sleep at night, a fact he mentioned to her directly, unprompted, at the hospital's annual staff appreciation dinner the following June. "I want you to know," Preston told her, standing awkwardly near the punch bowl in a rented banquet hall that smelled faintly of catered chicken, "that I've thought a great deal this year about how close this hospital came to displacing 41 people because I couldn't find another way to balance a budget, and how the only reason we found another way was because a nurse on the night shift decided a lonely old man deserved 45 minutes of her time. I don't know what to do with that professionally. There's no line item for it. But I know it's true, and I wanted you to hear me say it plainly, at least once, instead of just writing you a good performance review and calling it even." "You don't owe me anything, Preston," Maggie said, and meant it. "You did your job. You brought a hard problem to a board honestly instead of hiding it. That's not nothing either." The following October, almost exactly 1 year after Walter Voss had first been wheeled into room 412 with a fractured hip and no listed visitors, St. Aldrich's Memorial Hospital held a small, deliberately modest gathering to mark the anniversary of the Eleanor Voss Continuing Care Fund's founding, not a gala, nothing that would have made Walter uncomfortable with its scale, simply a gathering in the hospital's largest conference room, the same room where the board had voted the previous December, now repainted and considerably brighter, with sandwiches from the diner and coffee in the hospital's usual paper cups rather than anything more formal. Harriet Lynn spoke briefly about the fund's first year of operation, reporting that the wing had, for the first time in memory, run not merely at break-even, but with a small surplus that the board had voted unanimously to direct toward hiring 2 additional long-term care nurses, positions that would allow every nurse on that hall, including Maggie, to work more reasonable hours without the constant understaffing that had made her original 45 minutes with Walter such an act of genuine sacrifice in the first place. "I want to say something briefly, if I might," Walter said when Harriet Lynn finished, standing now without a cane most days, though he kept one nearby out of what he called an old man's reasonable caution, his color considerably better than it had been the previous December. A full year of Harrow Falls quiet, attentive community having done something for him that no amount of medical care alone could have. A year ago, in this room, 11 people voted to save a wing of this hospital rather than close it. And I want to be honest that I have, in the year since, occasionally worried that people would remember that vote as the moment Walter Voss saved St. Aldrich's Memorial Hospital with his money, and I would like to correct that memory today, plainly. For the record, I did not save this wing. I funded a solution to a problem that had already been identified, thoroughly and honestly, by Mr. Cade and this board over more than a year of difficult, unglamorous work that nobody was applauding them for at the time. And even the money, considerable as it was, would have meant very little if this hospital did not already contain on its staff the actual thing worth funding. People willing to give more of themselves than any job description or paycheck required quietly, without an audience, for years before anybody noticed or thanked them for it. I spent 6 years anonymously giving this hospital money because I believed in what its staff did with insufficient resources. I spent this past year learning, from one specific nurse in particular, what it actually looks like up close, night after night, when that belief turns out to be earned. That is the version of this story I would like remembered a year from now, and 10 years from now, long after the specific dollar figures have been forgotten. Not that a rich man saved a hospital, that a hospital full of people who already knew how to save each other happened to have in one specific room a rich man who finally noticed and decided to help. Maggie, standing near the back of the room next to Denise Okafor, felt her eyes go hot and did not try particularly hard to stop it, and found when she looked around the room that she was far from the only person quietly wiping her face. Preston Cade included, standing near the front with an expression that suggested a man who had, over the preceding year, been given back something about his job he'd genuinely feared losing. Afterward, in the parking lot, Walter found Maggie by her car, Danny and the kids waiting in their own vehicle a few spaces down, Sam pressing his face against the window, making faces at his mother to hurry up. "I have something for you," Walter said, holding out a small, plainly wrapped package that Maggie could tell, from its shape and weight, was a book. I debated for some time whether this was too much, and Claire assured me it absolutely was not, and I've learned over the past year to trust Claire's judgment on matters of the heart considerably more than my own. Maggie unwrapped it carefully in the parking lot, the October evening cool around them, and found a first edition, genuinely old, its cover soft with real age rather than manufactured distress, of the exact copy of the Odyssey she had read to him that first October, except this one, when she opened the cover, contained an inscription in Walter's own careful, slightly shaking handwriting. For Maggie, who needed no reason to pay attention, and who taught an old man that the reading was never really about the books at all, with more gratitude than these pages could ever hold. Walter. "This is too much," Maggie said, her voice thick, echoing Claire's prediction with an accuracy that made Walter smile. "It is exactly the right amount," Walter said. "I have given this hospital $40 million over the years, Maggie, and I want you to understand, plainly, that this book and the friendship it represents is worth more to me than every dollar of it combined. Because the money bought equipment and buildings and endowments, all of which matter, all of which I'm proud of. But you gave me back a reason to want to keep living, at an age and in a condition where I had genuinely stopped being sure I had one. There is no dollar figure for that. There never will be. So I am giving you a book instead because it is, in the end, the only currency either of us ever actually dealt in from the very first night, and I find I would like to keep dealing in it, with you and with your family, for whatever years I have left. Maggie Doyle drove home that October evening with the old inscribed copy of the Odyssey sitting carefully on the passenger seat beside her. Sam and Lucy arguing cheerfully in the back about whether the Ankylosaurus story Walter had told them at his last visit was scientifically accurate. Danny driving ahead of her in his own truck, with his blinker on early the way he always did. A small, steady habit of care she'd stopped noticing years ago, and found herself, that particular evening, noticing all over again. The way a year of watching Walter Voss learn to notice things had taught her to notice her own life a little more closely, too. She thought, driving past the diner on Route 9 with its bell over the door and its pie case that had been there since Eisenhower, past the hospital where she'd spend 3 more night shifts that week in the wing that now bore, in spirit, if not in official name, something of her own quiet habit stitched permanently into its walls. About how strange and unplanned the entire last year had been, how she had walked into an ordinary Tuesday shift in October, expecting nothing more than another 12 hours of vitals and charting and tired feet, and had walked out of that same shift, without knowing it yet, already on the path toward the most meaningful friendship of her adult life. She thought about the version of herself that had almost not gone back a second time, that first week, tired and rushed and entirely justified in simply clocking out and going home to her own family instead of lingering in a stranger's room for 20 unpaid minutes. She thought about how close that decision had come to going the other way. Some nights, in the exhausting early weeks before the ritual had become sacred, before she understood what it was actually building. And she thought most of all about something Walter had said to her only once, months earlier, in the depths of the sepsis scare, when he still hadn't been certain he would survive the night and had asked her in a rare, unguarded moment whether she thought a life like his, built primarily around building and protecting money, however generously redirected in its final chapter, had actually amounted to something worth having lived. She had told him then, and she believed it more fully now than she had even in the moment she'd first said it, that a life doesn't get measured by the total sum of what a person built or earned or gave away, but by the specific, particular moments when they were fully present for another human being who needed them, and that by that measure, whatever else was true about balance sheets and trust funds and 60 years of building Voss Emerson from a single machine shop, Walter Voss's life had been worth an enormous amount because he had shown up, completely and without reservation, for exactly the people who happened to be in front of him when it mattered most, for Eleanor across 51 years and 2 cancer diagnoses, for a hospital wing full of strangers he never expected thanks from, and in the end for a night shift nurse and her family who had asked him for absolutely nothing and received in return more than either of them had known how to ask for. It would be easy, telling this story after the fact, to make it sound like Maggie Doyle always knew what she was doing, that she recognized from the very first night in room 412 that something significant was beginning, that she had some clear vision of where 45 unpaid minutes a night might eventually lead. The truth, as she would tell anyone who asked her about it in the years that followed, was considerably smaller and considerably more ordinary than that, and she came to believe that the smallness of it was the entire point. She had not set out to save a hospital wing, or reconcile an estranged father and son, or become the namesake, however unofficial, of a reading room in a hospital corridor. She had simply noticed a lonely man sitting alone in the dark and had been unable to walk past his door without turning on the light, and every single other consequence, the endowment, the reconciliation, the entire unlikely sprawling year that followed, had grown outward from that one small, unremarkable decision, made by a tired woman at the end of a long shift who had no idea, and could not possibly have had any idea, how far a single kindness might eventually travel once it was set loose in the world. Walter Voss lived 4 more years after that October gathering, long enough to see Sam graduate middle school and Lucy learn to read chapter books on her own, long enough to watch Bradley marry a kind, steady woman named Renata, whom Walter adored instantly and completely, long enough to see Claire's design practice grow into a respected small firm with projects in 6 states, long enough to watch the Quiet Hour Room at St. Aldrich's become, by quiet local reputation, one of the more beloved small features of the hospital, a place where dozens of families over those years found a sunlit corner to simply sit with someone they loved during the hardest weeks of their lives. He died finally on a quiet spring morning in his own small house on the edge of Harrow Falls, with Bradley and Claire beside him, and with Maggie Doyle, who had taken the day off work the moment Dr. Anand called to tell her the end was likely near, sitting in the same kind of hard chair she'd once occupied in room 412, reading him the final chapter of the same collection of poems she had given him that first Christmas, her voice steady, even as her own eyes filled, because she understood, better than almost anyone else in that room, exactly what it meant to be the last voice a person hears, and she was not going to let it be anything less than gentle. The hospital held a memorial service for him 3 weeks later, not at his request, since Walter had specifically asked, in the plain, careful instructions he left behind, for nothing large or ceremonial, but at the quiet insistence of a town that had, in the 4.5 years since his winter in room 412, come to consider him genuinely one of their own, rather than simply a wealthy benefactor passing through. 300 people came to a service, meant originally for perhaps 50, filling the high school gymnasium where the mayor had once announced the industrial facility groundbreaking in an entirely different story, and Maggie Doyle, asked by Claire and Bradley both to say a few words, stood at a small podium in front of the largest crowd she had ever addressed in her life, and found she did not need any prepared remarks at all, because everything she wanted to say, she'd already said to Walter directly, many times, across 4.5 years of Sunday afternoons and hospital nights and ordinary dinners at her own kitchen table. I met Walter Voss on an ordinary Tuesday in October 5 years ago, when I was simply a tired nurse near the end of a long shift, and he was simply a lonely man with a book he could no longer read for himself, Maggie said, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium's old speaker system. I did not know, that first night, that he was one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania. I did not know he had quietly funded half the equipment in the building where I worked. I knew only that he seemed to need somebody to sit with him for a little while, and I happened to have 20 minutes to spare. I want every person in this room to understand, because I think Walter would want you to understand it more than anything else that gets said about him today, that everything that followed, the endowment, the wing, the reconciliation with his son that saved both of them, all of it grew out of exactly that. 20 spare minutes, offered without any idea of where they might lead. I don't say that to take credit for any of it. I say it because I think it's the only part of this whole extraordinary story that any of us can actually go home tonight and repeat ourselves. None of us have $3 billion. Most of us will never fund a hospital wing or save 41 strangers from being displaced from their homes. But every single one of us, every single day, walks past somebody who is sitting alone in a room, literally or otherwise, needing nothing more complicated than 20 spare minutes and somebody willing to turn on the light. That was the whole lesson Walter Voss taught me, in the end, underneath all the money and all the drama of that one long winter. Be the person who turns on the light. You will rarely find out what it was actually worth. Once in a great while, you will find out it was worth more than you could have possibly imagined. But the value was never actually in the finding out. It was always simply in the choosing to stay a little later, for somebody who needed it. On an ordinary Tuesday, nobody else was watching. After the service, the crowd filed slowly out of the gymnasium into a bright, ordinary spring afternoon, the kind of afternoon Harrow Falls produced dozens of every year without anyone remarking on it, and Maggie stood for a while on the front steps with Danny's hand in hers, watching Bradley and Claire receive a long, patient line of townspeople who each wanted a moment to say what Walter Voss had meant to them, a surprising number of whom, Maggie realized listening in, had never known about the money at all, had simply known him as the quiet man at the diner counter who asked genuine questions about their lives and remembered the answers months later, or the man who'd quietly covered a young family's overdue electric bill through the church's benevolence fund without ever letting his name attach to it, or the reason the Little League finally had matching uniforms. The specific, enormous scale of what he'd given the hospital had made the newspapers once, briefly, the winter it happened. But the ordinary daily scale of who he'd actually been in the years since had made itself known to Harrow Falls one small, unremarked kindness at a time, exactly the way he'd have wanted it to, and exactly the way, Maggie thought. Watching Sam now nearly as tall as she was, and Lucy already talking about which college she wanted to study marine biology at, most of the kindnesses that actually hold a town together tend to happen quietly, without a plaque, noticed mainly by the people who receive them, and occasionally, if the world happens to be paying unusually close attention that particular year, by everyone else as well. The Quiet Hour room at St. Aldrich's Memorial Hospital is still there, 5 years after that spring afternoon, still stocked with donated books, still occupied most evenings by some family member who has decided, the way Maggie once decided, that 20 spare minutes were worth more than the exhaustion of an already long day. The brass plaque beside its door has never been updated to mention Walter Voss's name, or Maggie's, exactly as both of them would have insisted, and reads today precisely what it read the day it opened, for those willing to stay a little later. New nurses on the long-term wing hear the story eventually, usually from Denise Okafor, who still works the charge position and still tells it, every single time, with the same disbelieving warmth she felt the first night she heard about the box of poetry books arriving by unmarked courier van. Some of those new nurses go on to have their own version of it, their own room 412, their own lonely patient nobody visits, and their own quiet decision, made alone, at the end of an exhausting shift, about whether to walk past the door or turn on the light. Nobody keeps a record of how many of them choose to stay. That was never really the point of keeping score in the first place. If a story like this one moved you even a little tonight, we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe, because we tell one of these true stories every single day. Real people, real kindness, real reminders that the smallest, most unglamorous choices we make, the ones nobody applauds and nobody ever finds out about, are so often the ones that end up mattering most in the end. Leave a comment and tell us about a small kindness that changed the course of your own life, or someone else's, because we read every single one, and some of the stories you share end up becoming the very next video we tell. And if you believe, the way Maggie Doyle came to believe, that the world keeps turning mainly because ordinary people keep choosing to stay a little later for somebody who needs it, share this story with somebody who needs to hear that tonight. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next story.